Chapter 161, I Like Your Eyes. Although Mentor Rum didn't seem very pleased, he still allowed Saul to leave. However, not long after Saul left, someone knocked on Rum's door again. Mentor, it was Nick's voice. After being granted permission, Nick entered. He had a constant smile on his face, which was a stark contrast to his usual expressionless demeanor. Rum studied Nick for a few moments, quickly understanding his current state. The potion has been absorbed well. Nick's smile became brighter. Yes, Mentor, I can feel my emotions becoming more stable now. I don't have to suppress myself as much as before. Unexpectedly, Rum sighed. You've stayed at second rank for a long time, and it always makes me wonder if this path is truly right for you. This is the path I chose myself, Mentor. You don't need to worry, Nick said. But his expression suddenly changed, and he couldn't help but start crying. Rum was unbothered, knowing that this was a necessary trial for Nick's advancement. For everyone, except for a few exceptionally gifted individuals, advancement was never easy. In the world of wizards, every stage of advancement was dangerous, yet necessary. Once you chose to walk the wizard's path, you had to keep progressing. Stagnation was a danger that could be fatal. Rum lightly tapped his stomach, causing ripples to form. I heard the Tower Master rescued you along the way and even took Saul with him. Nick calmed down a bit, wiping his tears. Yes. He thought for a moment before adding, Byron once said in the Hanging Hand Valley that Saul is the Tower Master's student. Although he later explained that it was a lie to deceive the enemy, I now think maybe Byron was telling the truth. Rum slowly nodded. He nodded slightly, as any bigger movement would cause his chin to touch the fat on his neck. Perhaps Saul's duties in the tower were also arranged by the Tower Master. It's a pity. He was really suited for specializing in light magic. In this wizard tower, no one could defy the orders of the Tower Master, Gorsa, not even the high-ranking mentors. Suddenly, Rum shifted the topic. Have you been to Grindsail Town? Nick had already submitted this task at the registration office, but hadn't mentioned that Saul had completed it for him. He had some personal motives for this task, and wanted to conceal his own involvement as much as possible. But now that Rum had asked him directly, Nick, still in an unstable emotional state due to his advancement, didn't dare to hide anything. He could only dodge the question slightly and said, Before reaching Grindsail Town, I received the news of my father's death and asked someone else to complete the task for me. Now, most of the Grinding Sound Fruits fields there have been destroyed by the barbarian invasion, and it seems they will no longer be able to contribute Grinding Sound Fruits. I've already suggested to the registration office to withdraw protection for Grindsail Town. No need for all that trouble, Rum smiled softly. Grindsail Town is completely gone. Nick raised his head in shock, his surprised expression unmistakable, even with a hint of fear. Rum, however, didn't seem concerned at all. It's good that you've started advancing, so you don't need Grinding Sound Fruits to suppress your emotions anymore. Nick seemed a bit strange. He clenched his lips, the muscles at the corners of his mouth twitching, his pupils narrowing to pinpricks. It was as if he had heard something terrifying. Rum suddenly reached out and placed a hand on Nick's head. Don't be so scared, Nick. You're one of my most favored students. Even if you occasionally make small mistakes, I won't just eat you up right away. Nick suddenly collapsed to the ground, trying to beg for mercy, but his throat trembled and he couldn't speak. Watching Nick's emotional outburst, Rum's head slowly slid from the top of his body down to near his stomach, gazing at Nick's forehead, which was now sweating. Forget about Grindsail Town. Don't worry about Saul either. Rum's hand gently stroked Nick's head. As he did, strands of brown hair fell to the ground, then dissolved as if being corroded. Yes, Mentor, Nick said, his eyes fixed on the hair on the floor, tears uncontrollably falling down. Although this is Gorse's Wizard Tower, I am still your mentor. If you truly don't want to get involved, just focus on your research. As a student I value, your stance is already decided. Stop trying to please both sides. Yes, yes, mentor. Nick's teeth started to chatter, his voice hoarse and unclear. Since you're about to advance, I'll let you off this time. Go to the room across the hall and wait until your emotions stabilize before you leave. Yes. Nick backed out of the separated room, crawling out. When he left, his hair had completely fallen out, leaving behind an uneven bald head. Rum's head returned to the top of his body. Well, it doesn't matter, he seemed to answer an unasked question. No movement at all would make people suspicious. At least Bill is dead, right? It saves you from needing to act. Ha. Laughter echoed in the room, muffled by the thick curtains, not a sound escaping. What? After leaving Rum's room, Saul had no idea what kind of cost Nick had paid for his little scheme. His attention was completely taken by the conversation of some passing apprentices. I heard that the second-rank apprentice who took the corpse flower task last time voluntarily gave up. Two second-rank female apprentices were whispering on the slope between the 12th and 13th floors. Saul, pushing a cart, slowed his steps. Is the task really that difficult? I don't think solving the problem is hard. The real challenge is finding the person who created the problem. After Sari took the task and waited for a few days, there was no sign of anything abnormal. Then, just yesterday morning, another servant died. The other female apprentice, with her braids swaying like cobras, laughed dismissively. Lucy, how about we take the task? Since someone already gave up, the reward credits will probably increase. The apprentice named Lucy was tempted. All right, let's go now. We can't let anyone beat us to it. The two quickly agreed and disappeared around the bend. After taking small steps for a while, Saul finally started walking. As expected, my second dream is coming true. When he passed the 12th floor, Saul glanced inside. The corpse flower that used to stand in the hallway had long been cleaned up. I hope they can solve the mastermind. I could really use a good night's sleep. Second-rank apprentices didn't have regular classes. Of course, if they really wanted to attend, they could sit in on first-rank classes. Once they reached second rank, the knowledge gaps between apprentices became more evident. Forcing them into the same class would only hold everyone back. So, after advancing to second rank, most of their learning was self-directed, with occasional guidance from mentors. Otherwise, apprentices might end up walking down the wrong path, unintentionally blowing themselves up. First-rank apprentices had to undergo progress tests every month, while second-rank apprentices only had to test every 6 months. But since Saul had just advanced to second rank, he had a full year of preparation before his first test. For a long time, he didn't need to worry about testing. So, after getting used to the work in the second warehouse, Saul began his new round of research. The materials in the second warehouse were abundant, with a small portion lacking any labeling. According to the rules, Saul was allowed to use them, as long as he didn't waste them carelessly. The materials in the warehouse could only be used by him, and not given to other apprentices. Although this work was tedious and didn't allow much time for study, it still attracted many people. Though there were no big men guarding the warehouse like in the corpse warehouse, those 3 metal doors were no mere decoration. They were connected to something related to the communication pens, automatically identifying which materials were within the task requirements and which were not. Once materials outside the scope were carried, the metal doors couldn't be opened. At least Saul couldn't open them. After 2 days of organizing the materials in the warehouse, Saul received another task from Mentor Kaz. This time, the task involved dozens of materials. Fortunately, Saul had already prepared a search list, or it would have been hard to finish on time. While pushing his cart out of the warehouse, Saul encountered someone on the way. The person, like the tower master, wore a heavy cloak and a mask, coming from the left corridor. He must be the one in charge of the first warehouse. Saul stopped in his tracks, wondering whether to greet him. But the person walked straight past Saul without stopping. No greetings, no acknowledgement. Saul couldn't help but smile bitterly. After having a few friends in the outside world, he almost forgot that the Wizard Tower was actually a cold place. However, Saul's smile hadn't faded when the person suddenly stopped. Immediately on alert, Saul also halted, maintaining a distance of 2 meters between them. The person didn't turn around, instead bowing deeply. As the head lowered, a crack appeared at the back of the person's hood. From within the crack, an ugly woman's face emerged. It looked like something out of a sinister animated witch. "I like your eyes, can you give them to me?" the woman asked in a hoarse voice. "Sorry," Saul's expression darkened. "I still need them." Chapter 162, Save Me. The witch's face, which had been directly facing him, suddenly turned to the side, revealing another face beneath the hood. From the nose and chin, it seemed to be the face of a young man. The lines of his face were striking, with a straight nose, and he was probably quite handsome. The man's face spoke. "I can exchange credits with you and guarantee to give you a pair of useful eyes." After undergoing several body modifications, Saul was not opposed to changing his limbs. However, eyes were an important and dangerous organ. Whether the other party was eyeing his eyes or his cocoon, Saul couldn't casually give them away. "I want them." The witch's face didn't give up, even acting like a child and pouting. Using that face to act cute was, frankly, quite unpleasant to look at. "Quiet," the man snapped. But after the witch shut up, he continued to increase the stakes. "I can guarantee the eyes I offer will be absolutely useful. If you don't like human eyes, I also have the eyes of extraordinary creatures like the cold night bird or the queen fly." Saul let go of the cart handles and smiled politely. "Sorry, I'm not considering getting new eyes right now. If I need them, I'll come to find you." The man raised his hand and lifted his hood, revealing 2 mismatched blue and purple eyes that stared deeply at Saul. Just as Saul thought the man might take action, he suddenly lowered his hood again. "My name is Haywood. If you change your mind, you can find me in the first warehouse. As for your hands, I also have better modification options." After saying that, Haywood continued forward, but the witch's face on the back of his head began to cry like a baby. The quiet corridor was immediately filled with eerie crying, which lingered for a long time. Saul waited until the man pushed open the metal door and disappeared from sight before wiping the cold sweat from his temple and pushing the cart forward again. When Haywood revealed his eyes, Saul suddenly felt an eerie sensation, as if he had been completely seen through. It was as though Haywood possessed X-ray vision, scanning every secret of his body. Especially when his eyes swept over Saul's bone arms, Saul felt the magic within him begin to uncontrollably fluctuate. Fortunately, the diary didn't issue a warning. Otherwise, Saul was ready to take the initiative. "That person is a very powerful third-rank apprentice. He's currently in the Wizard Tower, so he has some restraint. But if I meet Haywood outside the Wizard Tower, he may not bother negotiating with me." Saul clenched his fists, the bones of his arms tightening with a cracking sound. "I can't be content with being a second-rank apprentice. Even among those at the same rank, some are stronger than I am. I still need to continue learning." Saul reached the metal door, waited for a moment, and then carefully pushed the door open. The room, filled with boxes, was empty. The two-faced Haywood had apparently not planned to ambush him and had already left. When Saul saw Mentor Kaz, he was in the laboratory guiding new apprentices. There were 4 apprentices in the lab, all around 10 years old, staring up at Kaz, only to receive his ruthless mockery in return. One girl even had red eyes from holding back tears. "Mentor, I've brought the materials you asked for." As soon as Kaz stopped, Saul quickly pushed the cart forward. "You all go back. If you can't even understand this much, then don't bother becoming wizards." Kaz dismissed the others and didn't even glance at the items Saul brought, pushing the cart aside. "These things aren't that important. How's the new job going?" Kaz, rarely showing concern, asked about Saul's work. "It's fine. There are many materials in the warehouse, so it takes time to find things. I'm working on organizing them." "Is that your impression?" Kaz frowned at Saul. "What about the corpse swarm?" The corpse swarm had indeed given Saul a strange feeling, but compared to his previous experiences in the Wizard Tower, it wasn't that frightening. "They're a bit mischievous," Saul thought for a moment and summarized. "Heh," Kaz pretended not to hear. "The second warehouse is the most dangerous place in the Wizard Tower, but it's also the safest. You're quite good at research. Your first body modification technique even impressed me. I hope you continue to work hard, but remember to focus on soul research." "All right, I'll keep working hard," Saul agreed. How many times had his mentor mentioned soul research to him? Saul could sense a hint of urgency in Kaz's words. Did his mentor really trust him this much? Did he think his research could help Gorsa? Gorsa was the Tower Master, a peak second-rank official wizard. Saul's eyes flickered. Could it be that the Tower Master's condition was worsening? Was that why Kaz was putting some of his hopes on Saul in despair? After a brief mention, Kaz shifted the topic. He checked Saul's recent studies and gave him a list of books as additional study material. However, Kaz didn't offer much advice on the knowledge Saul wanted to learn about the separation of the soul. "I can only say that since you haven't been injured, it shouldn't be an external force causing the separation. You should pay attention to any changes in both your body and soul." Saul pondered this. After bidding his mentor farewell, he pushed the cart down the passage to the West Tower. He hadn't been to his dormitory in several days. This dormitory on the 12th floor, he hadn't even stayed in for a single day since he moved in. There were several opened and unopened boxes in the room. The table, cabinet, and bedroom were all in a mess. Now that he finally had time, he opened all the boxes and stacked them along the wall. That was his idea of tidying up. Saul took a bath in the washroom. Although he had learned how to clean himself quickly with spell, nothing beat a good soak in the tub. However, just as Saul was climbing out of the bath, the steam swirling around him, he noticed something strange in the mirror. "What's this?" Saul, holding a half-dry towel, walked cautiously toward the mirror. The mirror was fogged up, and he could only see a vague shadow moving closer. Saul raised his hand and waved. The figure in the mirror raised its hand and waved too. The frequency of the movements was identical, as if the previous anomaly had just been a trick of his eyes. But Saul was the least likely to trust that he had been mistaken. He raised his hand and wiped the mirror with the towel, leaving a streak behind. The towel wiped across the glass, but it was still covered with water stains. At least now Saul could make out the face in the mirror. The face revealed in the mirror was a woman's face. Saul had seen this face before. It was the same face he had glimpsed before Vinny left, beneath the shadow. "Vinny?" Saul asked cautiously. The face in the mirror turned expressionless. Under Saul's gaze, her lips twitched, and soon her entire face began to twitch. She opened her mouth repeatedly, trying to say something, but was firmly blocked by the mirror. Saul moved closer. "Vinny, what do you want to say?" He kept a close watch on his diary, but it didn't indicate any danger. The dormitory is generally safe, so maybe Vinny is trying to convey something to me. Saul thought, should I listen or not? His mentor always emphasized that the unknown was dangerous, but sometimes the known could be just as dangerous. Saul placed his hand on the mirror. "If you want to say something." Suddenly, the face in the mirror grew larger, and Vinny's delicate face quickly distorted into a terrifying, acid-burned, ghostly visage. The water vapor on the mirror obscured most of the grotesque image, but it left only the sunken lower eyelids and a glimpse of the nose bridge. A single droplet of water slid down from the corner of her eye, and when Saul's fingertip touched the mirror, he caught the tear. "Save me, save me, save me." Saul quickly pulled his hand back. The voice was one he recognized well. It was the voice of the puppet doll used to test his mental strength. Had it always been Vinny crying out from inside the doll? Or was it Lady Yura? Chapter 163, Soul Drifting. Ah, a sharp scream echoed through the air. The voice of help suddenly became unbearable, and "help me" turned into an unconscious screech. The pressure on his eardrums was so intense that Saul quickly stepped back a few paces. The sudden shout abruptly ceased at that moment. Saul looked up and realized that Lady Yura's face had disappeared, but he noticed something even more baffling. His body had collapsed in front of him with a thud. He looked down at his chest, and sure enough, the soul-calling lamp lit up again. His soul had been forcefully ejected from his body by Lady Yura's scream. Saul couldn't help but rub his forehead. "So, how incompatible are my body and soul right now? I can't even walk without falling, and a shout makes my soul slip out." Fortunately, he spent most of his time alone, but what if his soul suddenly left his body in front of others and his body collapsed? That would be a problem. The image of the disfigured face he saw in the mirror earlier still haunted Saul. "This situation is seriously affecting my daily life. I need to resolve this as soon as possible." As for how to resolve it, Saul glanced at the diary on his left shoulder. "Looks like I'll be relying on you again for a while." The last time his soul left his body, Saul hadn't figured out how far he could drift before he needed to return. He simply traced a circle around himself and returned to his body. So this time, he decided to use the bathroom as his range, planning to walk a smaller circle. As soon as Saul took a step, he immediately felt a pull from his body. It turned out that in order to return to his body, he didn't need to find the furthest distance. He just needed to complete the steps outlined in the erosion diagram. However, after just 2 steps, Saul stopped and the pull vanished. "Maybe I can find a closer distance, the nearest distance." Saul moved closer to his body, nearly touching it, and then tilted his body, trying to walk back in just 2 steps. But this time, the pull from his fingertips didn't appear. No good. Could it be the distance is too close? Since he was in the relatively safe dorm, Saul started experimenting slowly, trying again and again. Only by understanding his body's situation could he avoid being caught off guard when real danger came. He took a step back, and each time he retreated, he turned his body and started walking in a clockwise direction. If something felt wrong, he stopped and moved further away. After a few steps, Saul was less than 2 meters away from his body. This time, when he followed the erosion diagram's movement again, he could feel the connection between himself and his body. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just as he was about to take the 6th step and return to his body, Saul hesitated. "It's still early. Maybe I don't need to rush back." Saul thought, "This is West Tower, the dorm area, so it's relatively safe. I can still look for the furthest distance my soul can drift." Starting from his body, Saul traced the invisible boundary of the arc, trying to find the maximum distance he could drift this time. After just a few steps, he realized that the circle had expanded again. If this keeps up, maybe one day the circle will touch some forbidden area. Even if my soul doesn't go that far, the field contamination could still harm me. Lost in thought, Saul walked out of his dorm and into the next room. There was no one living here. A single candle on the desk flickered, casting a dim light. The room was empty, the atmosphere cold, like a quiet tomb with no human presence. Saul continued walking, and as he turned into the hallway, he entered the next dorm. The candlelight in this room shone brightly, and there was someone living here. Saul stood in the corner of the dorm, looking up. The layout was identical to his own dorm. There was barely any furniture, and even books and experimental supplies were scarce. It was as cold as a prison cell. Across from Saul, there was a large bed, and a girl was curled up in the corner of the bed, her face streaked with tears, her body shaking with sobs. It was Angela. Saul hadn't paid attention to when she advanced to second rank, nor did he know she lived right next door to him. Suddenly, Angela looked up and whispered sharply, "Leave." Saul froze. Could Angela see him? Before he could test further, Angela continued crying, "Get out of my body, you demon." After shouting, she buried her head in her knees and sobbed. However, Angela's left hand lifted, gently brushing through her hair, as though someone were standing beside her, comforting her sadness. Angela doesn't see me, but is she experiencing a split personality, or is she being haunted by a spirit? Saul wasn't interested in delving into Angela's secrets, nor did he intend to help her resolve her problems. Eyes, arms, soul, Saul had his own problems to deal with. He continued walking, leaving the dorm and heading down the hallway. It was eerily quiet now, with no one in sight. Suddenly, a grayish shadow appeared at the end of the hallway, moving quickly toward him. It was running, but as the shadow got closer, Saul realized it wasn't a solid figure at all, just a shadow without a body. As the shadow passed by, Saul noticed it was a two-dimensional plane. The gray figure sped past him and then suddenly stopped, its head swaying back and forth as if searching for something. Seeing this, Saul quickly retreated into the dorm. He counted silently to himself, then stepped back into the hallway. This time the hallway was empty, and the gray shadow was gone. Sure enough, while most people can't see me in my soul form, some anomalies can sense my presence. Even in the West Tower, I need to be careful. Although he had only explored a few dozen meters, Saul could roughly determine the extent of his current range based on the curvature of the circle. He walked back to the bathroom, ready to return to his body, but once again he hesitated at the last moment. Strange, Saul rubbed his chin. I'm in soul form and can pass through walls, but why am I still being supported by the floor? Saul stamped his foot, trying to push it downward, only to be astonished when his foot sank into the floor. So I'm not actually standing on the ground, I'm standing in the air. With this realization, Saul lifted one foot and made a motion as if climbing stairs, stepping up one invisible step at a time, until his head emerged from the 13th floor's ground. This floating motion is a bit awkward. I guess I haven't fully mastered the essence of soul movement yet. Saul's head turned as his body followed, emerging from the floor. This room looked familiar. Isn't this Senior Concha's room? Since Saul delivered heads to her a few times, Concha had started requesting more frequent outside missions. Saul rarely saw her, so the head delivery transaction had naturally ceased. At that moment, the light in the room was bright, and the sound of water flowing from the bathroom could be heard. Concha's back, taking a bath. Concha had a very enticing figure. As a teenage boy, Saul couldn't help but imagine the scene in the bathroom when he heard the sound of running water. That image must be beautiful. Just can't look up. Concha is a tough one, and she didn't hesitate to ruin such a beautiful face. Saul shook his head, trying to dispel these distracting thoughts. He looked up at the ceiling and, realizing he was close to the 14th floor, muttered to the journal, "Should I go up and take a look?" Chapter 164, Conspiracy. Think it, do it. Confirming that the diary hadn't given any warnings, Saul ascended the steps again, as if climbing a staircase. Soon, his head emerged through the floor of the 14th level. The lights were on, and it was clear that this dorm room was occupied. A third-rank apprentice's dormitory was twice as large as that of a second-rank apprentice. After ensuring there was no danger, Saul fully emerged and began to wander around the room. Although the dormitory was larger, the extra space wasn't used for comfort. It was as simple as if it belonged to an ascetic. People who were content with pleasure could never become third-rank apprentices before the age of 30. The dormitory had the usual living room and bedroom, but there was also a relatively large storeroom and a compact laboratory. Just as Saul was about to enter the laboratory to see what its owner was researching, the diary appeared with a reminder: "Don't snoop around, be careful not to get sealed. Things being studied by a third-rank apprentice are still dangerous for me." The diary mentioned sealing, not going mad. Could it be they're researching a method to imprison spirits? Saul quickly took a few steps back, moving away from the laboratory. In retreat, he found himself in the bedroom next door. Before Saul could turn around, he heard a suppressed conversation entering his ears. "How could you let that little dwarf take your job?" Little dwarf taking the job. Saul immediately connected the dots. What a coincidence, this had to be about him. Turning around, he saw two tall men with muscular builds standing face to face in the middle of the bedroom. They were speaking in low voices, even their anger held in check. "Master Kaz personally sent him here and wouldn't even allow me to argue. What else could I do?" The man sounding somewhat defeated was Kujin, the one Saul had taken the job from. The other man, whom Saul didn't recognize, exuded the presence of a third-rank apprentice. "What could you do?" The other man's eyes darkened. "Kill him. Once the person with the job is gone, the task will definitely return to you." "Ferguson." Kujin's eyes widened, unable to hold back his voice, but quickly he lowered his tone again. "You've gone mad. We can't do this again. Do you think the mentor doesn't know? What's so impossible about it? Someone dying in the tower, what's so surprising about that? Does the mentor care about that? Don't forget, if we lose access to the storeroom, we'll run out of supplies. Do you want to become a useless fool again?" Ferguson countered, not backing down. Kujin narrowed his eyes, his expression darkening. "I think it's you who's in a hurry. If this thing is exposed, I'll be the main suspect. You, however, can stay out of it. After all, on the surface, no one would know our relationship." Seeing Kujin suspect him, Ferguson nearly lost his temper, but then seemed to think of something and suppressed his anger, even lowering his stance. "Yes, I am anxious, but what else can I do? Do you think I've stopped going out recently for no reason?" Kujin bit his lip, saying nothing, though a flicker of suspicion passed through his eyes. "Let me show you." Ferguson suddenly began unbuckling his belt. Saul's eyes widened instantly. As the belt came undone, his pants slid straight to the floor, as smooth as though no legs were even there to support them. Under Ferguson's wide pants, he was wearing tight black leggings. Yet his legs, tightly bound by the leggings, were unnaturally thin and scrawny, unlike his muscular upper body. It was as if the upper and lower halves of his body belonged to two different people. Kujin gasped, his face turning pale immediately. But what caught Saul's attention wasn't just that. He stepped forward to closely observe Ferguson's pants and found they were made from the same material as the black gloves he once wore. Those gloves had only been used for a short time before being ruthlessly discarded by the Tower Master. He was lamenting his lost magic crystals when Ferguson grabbed the waistband of his pants and pulled them down, revealing his legs. Saul quickly took 2 steps back. The sight of his legs was horrifying. Ferguson's legs were almost completely charred, as if they had been burned by intense flames. Just standing there, tiny black ash-like particles were falling off. How could such legs still walk or stand? The charred legs flickered with faint white electric arcs. This electrical phenomenon seemed familiar. After some thought, Saul realized that Ferguson's situation was similar to that of Monica. But while Monica's singed skin could quickly recover, turning her back into the beautiful woman she was, Ferguson's legs seemed beyond saving. My gloves were for defending against external electric shocks, but his pants are for isolating internal electrical currents, Saul muttered, imitating the Tower Master's tone. Both are clumsy methods. At this moment, a trembling Cugin finally spoke. "Why is this happening?" Ferguson silently finished putting his pants back on and answered with a gloomy face. "Using other people's methods to advance means you have to bear the stronger side effects." "Will I become like this?" Cugin clenched his fists, his forehead veins bulging. "If the materials aren't replenished." Before Ferguson could finish, Cugin took a step forward and grabbed him by the collar, his voice filled with anger. "You didn't tell me it would be like this." Ferguson remained impassive. "Telling you would you have changed your mind?" Cugin took several deep breaths to calm himself. "At least I would have had other choices." "A useless fool nearing 30 who can't advance. What other choices do you have?" Cugin's pupils trembled, his brows furrowing tightly. His fingers clenched the collar even tighter. In the room, both Saul and Ferguson stared at Cugin, waiting for him to make a decision. Cugin finally let go of his grip, his voice weak. "We have to take back the storeroom." Ferguson finally let out a sigh of relief. "How do you plan to do it? If you're afraid of trouble, we can lure him out and I'll take care of him. You can escape suspicion that way." To his surprise, Cugin just shot Ferguson a disdainful glance. "You only know how to kill people, huh?" Ferguson frowned, confused. "We can definitely bring that little bastard Saul into this." "But he doesn't need to steal materials," Ferguson asked in confusion. "I'm familiar with the second storeroom. Although some materials can be freely taken, they're either in small quantities, not very useful, or have strong side effects. Finding the right materials from there is much harder than outsiders think. Even after years in the storeroom, I've only come up with a few usable materials." "You mean?" "We can lure him with credits, or something else Saul would be interested in, and make him steal materials for us." "But that's too costly. Do you have a lot of credits?" Cugin suddenly grinned. "Who said we'll always give him credits? As soon as he violates something, we'll have leverage over him. At that point, we can offer him small benefits to make him do more for us." But Ferguson didn't approve of Cugin's plan. Just stealing something once, he might not be intimidated. Whether he takes the risk depends on the cost and the reward. If the reward is big enough, even the timid would kill. If the cost is small enough, he won't act cautiously. Cugin didn't wait for a confused Ferguson to respond and continued explaining. "The first time, I'll use something he's sure to be interested in to tempt him into stealing what seems like an insignificant but very important item." "What's that thing?" both Saul and Ferguson asked at the same time. Cugin spoke slowly. "A candle." There. Saul returned to his dormitory. The diary reminded him. He had been out too long, and the old house was about to catch fire. He couldn't keep eavesdropping on Cugin's plan. He hurriedly sank down into the washroom, walking 6 steps clockwise, and returned to his own body. "Yawn," Saul stretched, quickly putting on his clothes. "A candle." The scene before his eyes began to spin. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stumbled out of the washroom and collapsed onto the ground. His eyelids were as heavy as if they were tied with lead, and his arms felt limp as noodles. He crumpled to the floor, his last thought before losing consciousness. Was this soul separation a warning from Lady Yura? Chapter 165. Invitation from Cugin. Saul was running down the hallway. He had just created a new corpse flower and placed it in the corridor, and the moment the flower stood there, Saul instantly regained his clarity. However, this time, the dream did not end there. Finally, someone had discovered his evil deeds and was chasing him down. Now, that terrifying hunter had raised the bow and arrow in his hand, ready to release the string at any moment. Saul had been cornered on a slope, but another person appeared on the slope as well. The person blocking his path had only half a face, and Saul nearly tripped in fear as he ran. It was none other than Kanksha, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. "I got you," Kanksha's red lips curled up slightly. Saul turned around, and behind him was a person holding a silver-blue longbow with a dark expression. The pursuer was a third-rank apprentice. Compared to him, the seemingly terrifying Kanksha seemed to offer a more hopeful escape route. Saul heard himself quickly reciting a spell, his speed so fast that he could not even hear the runes hidden within. However, just as he was running and chanting the spell, an array of eyeballs suddenly emerged from Kanksha's head, which was filled with a half bottle of white liquid. These eyeballs were tightly pressed against the glass surface, full of insatiable desire and excitement, focusing intently on the approaching Saul. "Ah, die!" Saul was about to raise his hand, but suddenly his mind went blank, and he completely forgot what he was doing. Only a sharp, short scream remained. Saul abruptly opened his eyes and found his left cheek pressed tightly against the cold floor tiles. He did not rush to get up. This time, it seemed that the nightmare had ended with the death of the killer. If that were the case, it might actually be a good thing. At least, he no longer had to endure the disgusting feeling of tearing into raw flesh every time he slept. However, he still stayed pressed to the ground, observing his room from this angle for the first time. It felt like a timid voyeur, hidden in the most secret crevices, watching and alert to the outside world. Maintaining this posture, Saul felt a strange sense of reassurance. After a long while, he finally stood up and glanced at the time. It was 6:00 a.m., just in time for breakfast. Saul felt a little hungry. He raised his right hand, suddenly extending his tongue and gently licking his finger, now turned to white bone. The hunger seemed partially satisfied, but a deeper craving quickly followed. Saul took a deep breath, suppressing the wild emotions within him, and walked into the washroom. He filled a basin with water and then dunked his head into it. He stayed submerged until his lungs began to protest, and his trembling arms could barely support his weight. Only then did he abruptly lift his head. Water splashed everywhere, hitting the walls, the floor, and extra water flowed down his nose, face, and into his collar. "Damn," Saul cursed repeatedly. "I almost lost control of my consciousness." He wiped the water off his face with his hand. The faint pain from the friction between his bones and skin helped him snap back to reality. This nightmare butterfly has become so terrifying. Is it because of the magic radiation from the wizard tower expanding its influence, or is it about to hatch? The issue with his eyes had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Even if the owner of the dream went offline, Saul couldn't guarantee that he wouldn't be pulled into the dream of a more terrifying person during one of his future sleeps. Or rather, his consciousness. Should I go find Hayden for surgery now? Saul thought for a moment, but then dismissed the idea. Although I have the materials to seal the cocoon, they are not for dealing with nightmare butterflies. I don't know if that will work. Can't rush. Rushing makes things worse. Although he understood that the danger from the nightmare butterfly was far greater than he had imagined, Saul kept telling himself to stay calm. Danger comes from the unknown. I must figure out the characteristics of the nightmare butterfly. Even if I can't find the answer, any additional knowledge is better than none. Saul patted his left shoulder. "Come on, diary buddy, Can't you write a clearer description in your item identification?" The diary remained silent. "Let's head to the library," Saul decided. He still felt that it was too reckless to take out the butterfly cocoon just yet. If he couldn't find the answer in the library, he could ask his mentor. If all else failed, he could try acting on instinct. After all, Saul had the diary as a backup. After rearranging himself, Saul left his dormitory. Just as he opened the door, he saw a man standing outside, Cugin, someone he had to look up to. "Senior Cugin," Saul immediately flashed his trademark polite smile. "Did you need something from me?" "I have an experiment that requires an assistant. If you can get approval from Mentor Kaz, I believe you have the ability. If you're willing to join me, I can offer you 10 credits per session. Paid per session." And the rate was quite favorable. Saul's interest immediately piqued. "I'd be happy to help. But I'm curious, what kind of experiment is it?" "The contents of the experiment cannot be disclosed freely. If you don't have anything pressing right now, you can come with me." Saul hesitated for a moment, but did not move his feet. "Sorry, Senior Cugin, I actually have something very important to take care of." Cugin's expression darkened. Saul quickly suggested, "How about this afternoon at 2 p.m.? Cugin pondered for a few seconds, then nodded in agreement. "All right, 2 p.m. Come to my room, 1404. Saul immediately responded, "No problem." Watching Cugin's retreating figure, Saul kept the smile on his face. Since working in the morgue, he had come to realize that apprentices often made small trades in private. As long as the items involved weren't too extreme, the mentors usually turned a blind eye. But having witnessed the conspiracy between Cugin and Ferguson, Saul knew that this was no small trade. It was bait. Whether to bite and how to bite was still a question. Saul closed the door and quickly headed to the library. However, the issue with his eyes was more urgent. Compared to this, the experiment to reconstruct his hands could be postponed. It was still 6:05 a.m., and no apprentices had arrived at the library yet. As soon as he entered, Saul saw the arrogant young librarian standing proudly in the middle. Without greeting him, Saul quickly dashed inside, his arm unintentionally brushing past the librarian's clothes. No, not brushing past, he had gone straight through. The librarian had just opened his mouth to yell, when he suddenly noticed that a piece of his sleeve was missing. His mouth, which had been open wide, snapped shut, and just before his tongue could retract, it was severed and vanished midair before it hit the floor. The librarian's lips trembled as he slowly looked up, staring at the direction in which Saul had disappeared. He began to cry. The tears, too, disappeared before they could even fall. Saul had no idea what had happened outside. He was just following his memory, searching for information on the nightmare butterfly in the Advanced Basic Knowledge of All Things, Insect Edition. But after flipping through the entire index, he found no related entries and had to quickly move on to the next place. Advanced Knowledge of All Things Cognition, Foreign Objects Edition. Nothing. Advanced Knowledge of All Things Cognition, Monsters Edition. Nothing. Advanced Knowledge of All Things Cognition, Ghosts Edition. Nothing. Saul put down the last book. Even though he had hurriedly scanned the indexes, the high intensity of information input still made his head spin. This was the result after his mental strength had improved slightly twice. If this had been before, he would already be crawling out of the room. Should I go ask the librarian? Saul briefly considered this, but then a new thought came to mind. Nightmare butterfly. He looked towards the back of the library, as if his gaze had pierced through the white mist, landing on the 14th row of shelves. Even though the tower master had once told him that the person hidden beneath the 14th shelf was just his fear, Saul had not visited in a long time. Even if he did, he wouldn't have specifically gone to look for knowledge about spirits. And so, that person had been lying there at the very bottom of the 14th shelf, never showing themselves. Saul clenched his fists, silently walking towards the back of the library. Soon, he arrived at the shelf he had not forgotten. As soon as he approached, he saw the arm half exposed beyond the shelf's partition. Although I already know its nature, confronting fear head-on is still difficult. Despite saying that, Saul raised his foot without hesitation, walking straight up to the shelf. What exactly makes me so scared just seeing a hand? He took a deep breath, the faint mist entering his nostrils before being exhaled through his mouth. He crouched down, tilting his head slowly to the right until it was almost parallel to the ground. Finally, he saw it. He saw himself. Not Saul, but his past life, the one who had died. Face up, confused, with dark red corpse marks all over his skin. It was the body of the previous soul traveler. Chapter 166, Hunger. Saul hadn't seen himself in a very, very long time. So much so that he stared blankly for a few seconds, before realizing the person lying there was his past self. A man nearing 30, unshaven and hollow-eyed, a pitiful corporate slave. To this day, he still didn't know why he had transmigrated. Did he die from overwork late at night, or collapse from alcohol poisoning? His memories before arriving in this world felt plundered, his past so blurry it was like a dream. So what I fear is my death in my past life. Could it be that in those missing memories, something terrifying happened? Inside the library, the surrounding white mist was thickening, blurring his vision. Time is limited. The mystery of transmigration clearly isn't something I can unravel right now, Saul muttered as he reached toward the body in front of him. Blindly probing the unknown only leads to getting lost in it. Better to go with the flow. As his hand touched the figure before him, Saul's vision suddenly warped. The corpse vanished, and the bookshelves around him returned to being rows of thick tomes. These books were unlike any others. Each was at least 10 centimeters thick, and the covers were bound tightly with fine silver chains. Attached to the chains were small tags displaying the titles. The mist was starting to impair Saul's vision, making it harder and harder to see. Staying too long in the depths of the library risked getting lost. This was the mentor's method of driving apprentices away to keep them from delving too deeply into forbidden knowledge. He dropped to the ground, quickly scanning tag after tag. Just before the shelves were completely swallowed by mist, Saul finally selected 2 books. He pulled them free and ducked into the aisle between shelves, glancing around. After confirming the direction he'd come from, he grabbed the books and sprinted. The white mist thickened. His pace slowed. At last, just as his legs felt like they would give out, Saul stepped out of the mist. The entrance to the library loomed ahead, and with it, the elderly librarian. Clutching the books to his chest, Saul turned for a final glance. The bookshelves behind him were still shrouded in pale mist, tranquil and silent, patiently waiting for someone to come read. Everything that had just happened felt like a hallucination. But even though he'd nearly been trapped in the mist, the diary hadn't triggered any death warning. Did that mean the mist wasn't actually dangerous? Or was it because he had advanced to second rank? "You're borrowing these 2 books," the elderly librarian, who had been suppressing some inner excitement at the doorway, now walked up to him when Saul didn't approach. Startled, Saul turned to see the man nearly in his face. He quickly stepped to the side. "Yes." "Let me see." The old man reached out both hands as if to take the books from Saul. In the past, he only reached out to take payment, never books. Caught off guard, Saul couldn't avoid the man's hands, and the books were snatched from his arms. But the old man simply gave them a quick glance before shoving them right back into Saul's chest. It all happened so fast, it was like nothing had occurred at all. I wouldn't recommend borrowing these for more than 3 days. The old man even offered advice. Did this grumpy old geezer take his meds today? Saul wondered in surprise, thanking him repeatedly. As he left the library, Saul couldn't help looking back one more time, only to see the elderly librarian with hands behind his back, smiling and nodding at him. Once Saul was gone, the librarian raised his hands to inspect them. All of his fingertips were shortened, as though something had devoured them. Yet his face was filled with elated joy. You were right, it does smell like freedom. Saul didn't return to his dormitory, nor did he head to the second storage room. He needed a relatively safe place to read the 2 books. For example, Mentor Kaz's laboratory. Each mentor's lab had a long-term apprentice, stationed there to maintain the space and serve as a guard. If anything abnormal occurred, the stationed apprentice would use a special communication device to alert the mentor directly. More often than not, the mentor would arrive quickly. It had been a long time since Saul had last visited Kaz's lab. As he pushed the door open, he saw a familiar figure. Angela sat at a desk, writing and sketching, though her dazed expression betrayed wandering thoughts. She looked exhausted. Saul had heard from Mark that, since entering the Wizard Tower, Angela hadn't worked anywhere but the lab. No matter who was previously assigned to manage the lab, she always managed to land the assistant position. Over time, Kaz's apprentices had all come to know her. To put it in Saul's familiar terms, the seniors came and went, but Angela was a constant. She had never seemed interested in changing jobs. She simply stayed put. Saul walked in and took a seat at the table, directly across from her. The sound of the chair scraping the floor startled Angela from her daze. She reflexively stood and looked toward the door. Seeing no one there, she belatedly noticed Saul in front of her. "Saul, it's been a while since you came by." She tried to smile, but the effort only highlighted her dark eye circles. Recalling Angela's seemingly split personality state from the previous night, Saul uncharacteristically asked, "You don't look well. Are you sick?" "No, not at all," Angela snapped back, her tone overly harsh. Realizing it, she quickly forced a smile. "I just haven't been sleeping well lately." Since she clearly didn't want to elaborate, Saul didn't pry. He placed both books on the table, studied their titles a few times, then carefully began undoing the chains on one of them. Angela watched him with a conflicted expression. After hesitating several times, she finally couldn't hold it in. But her right hand suddenly lifted, and she raised her index finger to her lips. "SHHA." Angela blinked, her eyes instantly brimmed with tears. She lowered her head, and 2 drops of tears fell on her robe, soaking into the fabric. She quickly raised the book in front of her, using it to shield herself as she wiped her tears away. Saul didn't notice anything unusual. The book had completely absorbed his attention. The one he opened was a collection of stories, tales of horrific events related to nightmares in the wizarding world. Saul flipped through them quickly. He wasn't reading for shock value. He was hopping to find any mention of the nightmare butterfly. To his surprise, he found it in the 5th story. The tale was simple. A powerful true wizard discovered that his son had uncovered a secret of his, and intended to use it to kill him and inherit everything. The wizard understood why his son wanted to kill him. He had become a true wizard at a young age, his appearance frozen in middle age. But his son, lacking aptitude, had remained an apprentice and was now old and frail. The wizard, out of fatherly love, foiled the plot but chose not to punish his son. But the son was unrepentant. Seizing the moment when he pretended to apologize, he launched a second attack. This time, the wizard struck back and killed his son outright. It was only in that moment that he realized he was the son. For some reason, He had inherited the true wizard's memories and confused his identity. As death came for him, the sun saw a beautiful silver butterfly flutter out of his vision. The story then shifted to the perspective of an unknown narrator. He explained that when the butterfly emerged from the sun's mind, it was captured by the true wizard. After some investigation, he discovered it was the nightmare butterfly, a creature exceedingly rare even in the wizarding world. But not long afterward, the true wizard died as well. Before his death, he gouged out his eyes, burst his eardrums, sliced off his nose, and leapt naked into a subterranean fire vein, burning alive. His final words were a repeated scream, "It's all fake, all of it's fake." At this, Saul slammed the book shut. The nightmare butterfly really can affect consciousness, or maybe it copies the consciousness of others. If the host lacks a strong enough will, they could completely lose themselves. Suddenly, a searing hunger twisted Saul's stomach. The craving for food broke through his thoughts. Food! He looked up and saw Angela across from him, eyes slightly red, quietly reading. Chapter 167. Saul swallowed. The Will of Malice. Saul suddenly stood up, and the chair behind him clattered to the ground. Angela, who had already been distracted, jumped in fright. Her large, clear eyes peeked out from above the book like a startled fawn, darting anxiously. She was 15 this year, just beginning to show the grace of a young woman. Among the many wizard apprentices, her looks were quite striking. Unfortunately, beauty held little value in the world of wizards. Weakness was only an invitation for others to attack. As she watched Saul step around the lab table and walk toward her, Angela's gaze shifted from confusion to caution. She stood up, already clutching a short black wand. "Saul, what do you want?" Saul's face was dark as he stared at Angela's pale, exposed neck, saying nothing. Angela grew more nervous. Saul's expression had completely changed. He seemed like a different person entirely. She quickly lowered her head and glanced at her left hand. Her expression instantly changed, and she stumbled backward in a panic, knocking her chair aside. Raising her wand, Angela gripped it tightly with both hands, the tip trembling. "Saul, I think something's wrong with you. Are you still conscious? I'm going to alert Carr." "Ah." Halfway through her sentence, Saul lunged at her. Angela hesitated no longer. She activated her wand, and a black beam shot toward Saul's face. In midair, the black light transformed into an octopus, stretching out to block Saul's escape from 8 directions. But Saul made no move to dodge. With a flick of his hand, a translucent worm shot out and collided with the black octopus. Though the worm seemed illusory, it struck the octopus aside directly. In the air, the black octopus began to sprout holes, like tender leaves being eaten by bugs. Angela realized immediately that Saul had just used a first-tier spell, but how had he activated it so quickly? Her eyes widened. She knew her wand couldn't match a first-tier spell, and the only first-tier spell she had was a supportive one, nothing that could turn the tide. She turned quickly to grab a crystal orb at her side. But the moment she moved, her left foot was seized by a transparent hand. With a hard yank, she crashed to the ground. Mage's hand, he's casting consecutively, without even stabilizing his mental construct. Ignoring her pain, Angela rolled over. A sharp arrow formed in front of her forehead and shot out instantly. At that moment, Saul was already midair, lunging toward her. Seeing Saul suspended above her, Angela felt a flicker of hope. He couldn't dodge now, and he'd already used his first-tier spell. Maybe she still had a chance. But in the next instant, a thick black tentacle, as large as a python, shot out from behind Saul's neck and wrapped around the arrow. Saul landed on top of Angela and pinned her to the ground. His skeletal hand showed no mercy as it pressed against her face, while his other hand took the sharp arrow from Alga and drove it toward Angela's eye. The black arrowhead loomed large in her vision. Angela stared in terror, unable to scream. Only muffled whimpers came from her throat. But just before the arrow struck, it stopped a hair's breadth away from her pupil. Saul let the arrow drop. He had used too much force. Now it was broken into several pieces, clattering to the floor. Saul slowly stood, releasing his grip. His bony palm left a horrifying imprint on Angela's delicate face. His gaze flicked to Angela's left hand. Just moments ago, it had been pitch black, but now that Saul had let go, it was quickly returning to normal. If he hadn't been specifically watching her hand, he might not have noticed anything at all. Angela. Angela was trembling as she climbed to her feet, too afraid not to respond. I don't know why, but I'm suddenly so hungry. Got anything to eat? I do. Then forget it. Saul returned to the lab table, picked up the 2 books he'd brought, and walked off as if his earlier murderous intent had been nothing but a figment of Angela's imagination. At the door, Saul glanced back. Angela visibly flinched. The door slammed shut with a bang. Angela immediately sat up, her face filled with grief and fury. She frantically grabbed a short blade from the lab table. Lifting it high in her right hand, she prepared to stab her own left arm. But her left hand suddenly turned black and swelled, dodging left and right. It morphed into the same black tentacle as before, evading her attack and quickly coiling around her right arm. The tentacle constricted tightly, and Angela's muscles and bones groaned under the strain. She could no longer hold the blade. Her fingers twisted, and the short knife clattered to the floor. Her burst of resistance was easily snuffed out. Angela collapsed to her knees in defeat. After a while, she suddenly began laughing through her tears. You dared to influence him. Do you think he's just some ordinary apprentice? I don't need to kill you, someone else will. Ha ha ha. The tentacle released her right hand and transformed back into a normal arm. Angela fell backward, staring at the ceiling of the lab. She muttered to herself, your scapegoat's already been caught. If you try again, they won't fall for it. Just then, the lab door suddenly opened again, and half of Saul's face peeked in. Angela screamed and scrambled backward, only to realize something was off. She suddenly grabbed a shard of the broken wand and hurled it at the door. Get lost, stare at me again and I'll tear your face off. That half of Saul's face immediately blurred like a watercolor painting soaked in water. The lines dissolved, the color drained away, and it turned into a pale mask that quickly withdrew. What? Saul clutched 2 books and hurried toward the East Tower. After reading about the nightmare butterfly, he'd suddenly felt the same overwhelming hunger as in his dreams. At first, he thought the book had triggered lingering effects from his nightmare. But then he realized something was wrong. If this book were really that powerful, it wouldn't be shelved on the 14th floor. It would be sealed deep within the library. Even Saul, with his powerful mental force, had been so heavily affected. If another apprentice read it, wouldn't they go mad instantly? Fighting back the madness, Saul entered a half-trance to search for the source of the disturbance. Soon, he spotted a thin black thread linking him to Angela's left hand. Angela dared to make a move against him. Saul sneered inwardly. He decided to play along, pretending to succumb and attack Angela in return. During their clash, the black thread kept sending fear, confusion, and other influences into him. But once he pushed past the initial madness, Saul's mental construct began spinning wildly, and the thread could affect him no more. Angela fell back again and again. The black thread eventually retracted. And Saul, if he had just driven the arrow down, Angela would be dead. But just as he hesitated, the diary suddenly intervened. May 3rd, year 316 of lunar calendar. The will of malice extends its invitation. You joyfully accept, dancing with it hand in hand. But take care not to damage its new body, for then it will have to find another close by. Too bad the poor Will of Malice doesn't know that inside its new body is a hungry baby. When the baby devours the innocent Will of Malice, it will grow into a wicked child. Guess what? When you become the Nightmare Butterfly's new host, how long will your sanity last? Will you become Gorsa's new collection piece? Or Rum's ultimate trump card? Angela couldn't be killed. The moment the diary appeared, Saul's fury dissipated completely. So Angela wasn't just suffering from a mental breakdown. The true culprit was the Will of Malice. The baby in Saul's body was, of course, the Nightmare Butterfly's cocoon. If it fully emerged, even true wizards would go insane. Saul couldn't risk letting it consume the Will of Malice. He spared Angela for now, but this matter was far from over. Saul soon arrived at the second floor of the East Tower, outside the second corpse chamber. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. The room inside was silent. The diary's warning made it clear. The Nightmare Butterfly was about to hatch. Perhaps all it needed was a little more energy, and the cocoon would become a butterfly. The Diary of Death wizard only issued warnings for things of true value. For it to acknowledge the Nightmare Butterfly's cocoon meant it was no ordinary entity. If it hatched, Saul didn't know if he could keep control with his current willpower. "Senior Hayden, are you inside?" No reply. The door was locked. Maybe Hayden wasn't there yet. Hayden never attended public lectures or worked in the lab. If he wasn't here, he was likely holed up in his dorm. Saul was wondering whether to go find him, when he suddenly heard a lock click. The blood-red door opened a crack, and one of Hayden's eyes peeked through. Saul beamed. "Senior Hayden, I'd like to ask for a small surgery." Hayden's eye rolled down to Saul's name tag, and he immediately opened the door wider and stuck out his head. "Senior Saul, what can I do for you?" It was a little awkward to call someone who entered the tower later than him senior, but Hayden, pushing 30 and still a first-rank apprentice, had long since gotten used to it. In the world of wizards, power was everything. "I want you to remove something from my left eye. Of everyone I know, you're the most skilled at that kind of surgery." Hayden's face changed instantly, and he shook his head frantically. "No, no, no, I can't. Saul, I've only ever taken things out of corpses, never out of a living person." "It's fine. I promise I'll be just like a corpse, completely still," Saul said sincerely. Chapter 168, Surgery. Saul was very polite, but his attitude left no room for refusal. Hayden hesitated for a long time, but eventually agreed. Because Saul had added one more sentence outside the door. "Senior Hayden, do you know why apprentices who haven't advanced to the 3rd rank by 30 are expelled from the wizard tower?" Hayden's hand, clenched around the doorframe, suddenly tightened. He stared fixedly at the nameplate bearing Saul's name and finally opened the door. "All right, come in. I'm not used to other places." Saul readily accepted and stepped into the second morgue, an area rarely open to outsiders. The moment he entered, Saul was struck by the layout. It was so tidy, so clean. Unlike Saul's messy lab bench and cabinets crammed to the brim, Hayden's morgue was neat and pristine, like an exhibition hall. The innermost wall was lined from floor to ceiling with display cabinets. Each display case had a glass door, allowing a clear view of the preserved contents inside. From top to bottom, they were organized by body parts, hair, eyes, noses, all the way down to feet of humans or other creatures. And the color deepened gradually from left to right. But Saul could tell at a glance that most of these body parts were normal, essentially useless materials. Even Hayden's workstation was impeccably orderly. The conveyor belt connecting the left and right sides was spotless, not a speck of dirt in sight. "Senior Hayden, you're really good at organizing." Hayden had both hands clasped together, pinching the webs between his thumbs. I just like keeping things in order." Saul had never seen Hayden in any of the first-rank apprentices, public classes. Chances were, he spent all his time buried in the morgue. "Saul, about what you said, that apprentices are expelled at 30. Isn't it because the tower master thinks those with poor aptitude are just wasting the tower's resources?" "Maybe that's part of it, I'm not sure. But the most important reason is—" Saul dragged out his words, then stopped abruptly when he saw Hayden looking at him anxiously. Hayden waited for a while, but when Saul said nothing more, he understood the meaning behind the silence. He didn't press the matter further, and instead turned to the main issue. "Saul, you said you want to remove something from your eye. Can you describe its properties?" Instead of answering, Saul pulled out several reagents from his robe. "I've already planned the surgery. I carry the necessary materials with me. It's just not convenient to operate on my own eye, so I came to bother you, Senior Hayden." Hayden froze, so he was just a tool. "All right then, what do you need me to do?" Saul patiently explained the entire surgical procedure to him. As he listened, Hayden's mouth gradually fell open, his mind racing with thoughts like, "This is even possible. And is this for real?" After laying out the procedure, Saul left the mentally overloaded Hayden behind and began preparing the reagents. He'd been planning to extract the nightmare butterfly's cocoon for a while now, and had made plenty of preparations. This time, Hayden would handle the extraction, while Saul was responsible for capturing and sealing the cocoon at the final moment. Yes, even though Saul was technically the one undergoing the surgery, he had a critical role to play. Whether it was his own experience of the cocoon suddenly entering his eye, or the tale he'd read of a butterfly escaping capture and killing a wizard in the end, Saul understood that this butterfly was not a tame creature. The good news was, the nightmare butterfly was still in its cocoon stage. The future villain had not yet fully emerged, and the diary had not warned of it harming Saul. At this point, he could still choose to destroy it or recondition it. Both options carried risks, but for now, the priority was to get it out and stop the nightmares. Soon he had 2 test tubes ready. One contained a clear, slightly viscous liquid that flowed well and didn't cling to the glass. The other held a purple fluid bubbling with tiny bubbles. "Senior Hayden, are you ready? The reagent takes effect 5 minutes after ingestion, and the effect lasts for 5 minutes." "I'm ready," Hayden said, taking a deep breath. "This is my first time operating on a living person. If it hurts, would you like a painkiller too?" But Saul simply tilted his head back and down the purple liquid. He frowned slightly at the lingering taste and glanced at the hourglass. "No need," he said as he walked over and lay down on the conveyor platform originally used for corpses. "Painkillers would dull my judgment." Hayden knew Saul was the ruthless type and didn't insist further. He moved to the tool station and picked up a fine needle, quickly disinfecting it as instructed. Disinfection, Hayden thought to himself. So this is the difference between operating on the living and the dead. Thus began a surgery performed by both doctor and patient. Because the doctor was a complete novice at working with living subjects, this honest and low-key Hayden had never done a live operation. The patient had to occasionally guide him based on real-time sensations. The surgery lasted exactly 4 minutes and 35 seconds. Though there were moments of panic, they managed to finish just within the time limit of the reagent's effect. In the final 25 seconds, Hayden used the smallest pair of tweezers to extract the cocoon hidden in Saul's pupil. He lifted the tweezers to take a look at what had been inside Saul's eye, but the moment his gaze landed on the small silver sphere, he was instantly captivated. It was no bigger than a grain of rice, yet once exposed to air, it began to grow rapidly. Its silver surface shimmered like starlight, deep, tranquil, as if one were gazing at the cosmos from a vast field. Unknowingly, Hayden fell into a trance and began slowly lifting the tweezers toward his own eye, as though wanting to insert the cocoon into his eyeball. Suddenly, a skeletal hand appeared before him. The bone fingers brushed past Hayden's cheek and snatched the silver sphere away. "No," Hayden cried out instinctively in anger. But when he saw Saul's appearance, the anger swelling in his brain was instantly doused with a bucket of cold water. Saul had already sat up on the conveyor table. His left eye was still fitted with a speculum holding the eyelid open. Blood trickled from the corner of his eye, trailing down to his chin. His originally black left eye had turned a dull, dark gray. And that was after Hayden's rudimentary treatment. But Saul didn't seem to care at all about the blindness in his left eye. He quickly tossed the cocoon into the transparent reagent and sealed the vial with a wooden stopper. A little of the clear liquid spilled out, but the rest filled the test tube entirely. The silver sphere bobbed up and down in the solution, as though someone were teasing it with a thin string. Once the sealing was complete, Saul tossed the test tube to Hayden. Hayden hurried to catch it, heart pounding. Observing it like that was dangerous. Now you can look at it safely. But this time, Hayden only gave it a brief glance before quickly handing it back. "No, no, this thing may be sealed, but it's still dangerous for me. I'd rather not risk another look. I nearly lost my mind just now." His demeanor had become even more deferential. In his heart, he was now certain Saul had far surpassed him in many fields. Seeing that Hayden had given up on further observation, Saul stored the test tube away. "This thing really tests one's willpower." Saul thought of the girl, Penny, "but I suspect someone with a pure heart wouldn't be affected as easily." Hayden's expression darkened. He possessed neither trait. If he had a strong will, he wouldn't still be a first-rank apprentice at his age. Saul took a roll of gauze from the workstation and wrapped it diagonally around his head, covering his left eye. Hayden stood quietly by, wanting to speak but hesitating. Saul knew what he was about to ask, so he answered the question he'd left hanging before entering. When a wizard stays at the same level too long, it attracts unknown contamination. The longer the stagnation, the greater the risk of contamination. The weaker the person, the faster the contamination arrive. To prevent apprentices from turning into contaminated entities, the Wizard Tower periodically expels older apprentices. Compared to other factions that just turn failed apprentices into experimental material, the Wizard Tower is actually quite merciful. Chapter 169, Negotiation. Saul fixed his one remaining right eye on Hayden and watched the blood drain from his face little by little. From what Saul knew, Hayden had always holed up in the morgue, skipping classes, avoiding research and making no progress. Most likely, he was simply waiting until he turned 30, so he could leave the Wizard Tower and live a quiet, free life. But reality was never that kind. The sheltered Hayden had finally come into contact with the truth he'd always avoided. His whole body slumped. He swayed slightly and braced himself on the workbench, sending the neatly arranged tools scattering in disarray. Just like his current state of mind. "I told you not to hide, you coward. Now look what's happened. It's all over, isn't it?" Hayden's face was deathly pale, yet the words he suddenly blurted out didn't match his expression at all. Seeing him like this, Saul lifted a hand and pinched his own chin, falling into thought. After 2 years of being neighbors, Saul had long since noticed that Hayden had some issues with his personality. He seemed to have developed a second persona. Whether it was caused by prolonged exposure to magical radiation or something broken deep within him, Saul didn't know. At first, Saul hadn't planned on getting involved. But during this collaboration, he suddenly found Hayden to be quite a capable assistant. No excessive curiosity, a solid foundation of knowledge, and a nearly complete mastery of all zero-tier spells. He was experienced in experimentation and had personally processed who knew how many guessed. Most importantly, Hayden had no backing whatsoever. Saul lowered his hand and interlaced his fingers. Senior Hayden, I'll give you a choice. Do you want to wait until 30 to leave the Wizard Tower, or do you want to make an effort in these last 2 years and try to reach third rank? Saul's question cracked Hayden's years of restraint just a little, but thinking of his current state, he deflated again. Saul, I'm already 28. Those 2 years you mentioned really are just 2 years. Saul didn't press him. He glanced back at the wall full of human specimen cabinets. If you change your mind and want to give it one last try, come find me. What? Saul walked toward the door. If you want to try, leave an eye outside the door. If I see it, I'll come find you. You want to help me? Hayden inhaled sharply, staring at the 14-year-old Saul. It seemed absurd, yet he couldn't help but want to believe. I'll do what I can. Saul shrugged and pulled open the morgue door. His pale knuckles stood out starkly against the crimson door. Leaving the morgue, Saul checked the time. It was almost time. He headed to Cujin's dorm for a meeting laced with hidden schemes. Your eye. Cujin opened the door and saw that Saul, who'd been fine just yesterday, now had only one eye. Just a little experiment mishap. It's nothing, Saul replied casually. But as soon as he entered the room, Cujin shut the door, leaving himself on the outside. Saul was stunned and immediately turned to open the door. Just as his hand touched the handle, a voice came from within the room. No need to panic. Cujin isn't joining us because the one who wants to talk about cooperation is me. He turned to see Ferguson, the guy who dropped his pants the night before. Saul's face showed the right mix of confusion and wariness. Senior, who are you? What business do you have with me? Sit down. Ferguson gestured to the table and chairs in the sitting room. I prefer to talk seated. Because you can't stand for long, Saul thought to himself, then hesitantly sat in the chair closest to the door. Ferguson chose the seat opposite Saul, adopting a proper negotiation posture. I don't know what tricks you pulled to take over Cujin's position these past few years, Ferguson said, lifting his chin, but I had an arrangement with Cujin. I provided credits or whatever he needed, and in return, he gave me materials exclusive to the second storage room. That direct. Saul straightened. That was a deal between you and Cujin. Now that he's left, I don't have the ability to continue that transaction with you. He wasn't dumb enough to blurt out, you were stealing materials from the storage room. Feigning ignorance was fine. Being too ignorant would be suspicious. Ferguson didn't beat around the bush either. What are you concerned about? The metal gate, Saul said. Since you've already made deals, you should know. The gate automatically verifies the task description. Anything not recorded through a message pen can't leave the room. We can help you with transportation. Anything else? Was that a hint that Cujin was involved, or were there other partners? Saul paused for a few seconds. What can you offer? Basic magic crystals, credits, and since you've taken on the storage room task, you probably can't leave the tower often. That means outside missions are off the table. If there's something you need that's not available inside the tower, you can let me know and I'll help you get it. Saul crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, thinking, quite the tempting offer you're painting. What exactly do you want me to transport? Let me be clear. If it's anything with a number, I won't touch it. Even if you say you'll handle the fallout, I still won't. Ferguson drummed his fingers lightly on the armrest. We naturally won't touch anything forbidden, just some ordinary materials. We're aiming for long-term cooperation. Now it was Saul's turn to think. How do I know that after working with you, someone won't secretly report me? Ha ha ha, Ferguson leaned back. What good would that do? As long as you say you use the materials yourself, do you think the mentors will go verify each missing item one by one? He wagged a finger at Saul. And don't even think about turning us in. First, we've been doing this for years. Second, the mentors actually know. We're not greedy, we're careful not to cross their bottom line. So these guys really had been smuggling materials for a long time, though some of what Ferguson said was likely meant just to reassure Saul. Even if Saul hadn't overheard their conversation, he wouldn't take Ferguson's words at face value. I understand, but I need some time to think about it. Saul glanced at the hourglass clock on the wall and stood up. It's almost 3. I'm heading back to the storage room. Ferguson didn't rise. His expression darkened slightly, hands clasped in front of his mouth. Saul, there's one thing you need to understand. We're not wandering wizards, not lone wolves on the wasteland. Short or long-term cooperation for a shared goal is normal. Why do you think Master Gorsa built the Wizard Tower? One person's power is always limited. Saul lowered his head slightly. I understand. That's also why I'm being cautious about cooperation. If I agreed to everything too easily, wouldn't you also worry that I might be playing a trick? Then Saul added, what exactly is it you want? Ferguson pursed his lips, hesitated, then finally said, for confidentiality, I'll only tell you right before you enter the storage room. If you don't leave the room for a while, or if you come out without the item we need, our deal ends immediately. Not giving Saul prep time, clearly to prevent him from planning anything. What they didn't know was that Saul had already overheard their plan. Saul pushed himself to his feet with a hand on his knee. All right, seems like the thing you want is that simple either. Ferguson's expression faltered. He didn't want Saul to think that. He quickly explained, nothing in the Wizard Tower's storage is truly simple. The reason we don't tell you in advance is to avoid any accidents. He tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. You'd better not waste too much of our time. Give us your answer by tomorrow night. Otherwise, we might find another partner. Saul's smile turned cold in an instant. Find another? Is that a threat? Being questioned by a second-rank apprentice infuriated Ferguson. He gripped the armrest tightly, intending to stand up, but the motion shifted from pushing to clenching. Not a threat, he said, suppressing his anger and squeezing the armrest as if trying to crush it. Just a necessary reminder. After Ferguson backed down, Saul immediately changed expression and smiled. Thanks for the reminder, Senior. Then I'll take my leave. But this time, he didn't promise to seriously consider it. Why is it always me who gets hurt? Saul pushed open the door and immediately saw Cugin leaning against the opposite corridor wall. The other man silently watched Saul, his figure seeming less imposing than usual. He didn't ask about the negotiation with Ferguson, as if he couldn't care less. Since Cugin was pretending to be an outsider, Saul played along, gave him a nod and walked away. He deliberately set the meeting time at 2 o'clock, just so no one would try to latch onto him afterward. But even so, Saul wasn't able to return to the warehouse before 3 in the afternoon. On the way to the morgue in front of the second floor of the East Tower, an unavoidable path, a figure shrouded in a cloak was standing in the middle of the hallway, waiting for him. Wizards really did like wearing those huge cloaks that covered their entire bodies. Saul had seen Tower Master Gorsa wear one, Haywood too. Wizards traveling outside especially preferred hiding under them. Not only did the cloaks block others' gazes, but they also helped conceal the wizard's often abnormal features. Saul stopped 5 meters away from the cloaked figure. From where he stood, he couldn't even tell if the person was male or female. Long time no see, Saul. The figure extended a slender, pale hand from beneath the cloak and gently pulled down the hood. Saul smiled. Long time no see, Senior Kongsha. I knew reaching second rank would be no issue for you. What I didn't expect was for you to snatch this job from Cugin the moment you advanced. It really wasn't me doing the snatching. Even though he was now a second-rank apprentice, Saul still felt a little nervous in front of Kanksha, especially when her eyes began to surface one by one. Saul didn't feel any less pressure than before. But what puzzled him to this day was why someone as powerful as Kanksha hadn't yet advanced to third rank. Sometimes, taking something doesn't require you to act. As long as you're recognized, you can replace someone with ease. Her crimson lips curled ever so slightly in a fleeting smile. Kanksha seemed genuinely pleased by how things had turned out. But gaining that recognition isn't easy, Saul said as he stepped forward. Did you wait here just to see me, Senior Kanksha? Kanksha turned around, looking into the dark depths of the corridor. I want to continue our deal. There aren't any more heads in the warehouse I can give you, Saul quickly said. I know, and I'm past the point of needing heads, Kanksha said with a hint of bitterness. Maybe because of her change in status, her tone toward Saul wasn't so lofty anymore. Then what do you need? Kanksha went silent. Saul had cut straight to the point, but she hadn't made up her mind yet. Saul didn't rush her. He quietly waited for Kanksha to respond. The longer she hesitated, the more important the item must be. And yet Saul didn't feel much pressure. After all, he was the one in control of this deal. That's why, whether facing a third-rank apprentice like Ferguson or someone like Kanksha, Saul remained calm. Kanksha started to speak, then suddenly snapped her head up. Who's there? Come out. Saul flinched and instinctively turned half around. But he still kept half his attention on Kanksha. Her outburst sounded far too much like a distraction tactic. Yet the corridor behind him was completely empty. Even the nearest morgue was nearly 100 meters away. And while the corridor had a curve, there was nothing to hide behind. Could it be an apprentice skilled in invisibility? Saul noticed Kanksha wasn't moving, just staring into the hallway behind him. That suggested there really might be a third party. Invisibility was a second-tier spell. If someone really was hidden nearby, they had to be at least third rank. Kanksha seemed to realize that too. Suddenly, more than a dozen eyeballs surged onto her glassy head. They stacked layer upon layer, each pupil scanning in a different direction. Saul noticed that Kanksha had more eyes in her head now, and several of them clearly weren't human. Suddenly, one of her eyes dilated sharply, the pupil expanding until it nearly consumed the entire eyeball. I see you. All her eyes rotated in unison, locking onto one specific direction. But even under her collective gaze, nothing stirred. Saul, let's go inside, Kanksha said, stepping backward into the darkness at the end of the corridor. Saul didn't doubt her judgment. He glanced one last time at the spot she had focused on. Unfortunately, the one lurking there wasn't a spirit. His semi-immersive meditation method was useless. He turned sideways and followed her, step by step into the shadows. Once both Saul and Kanksha had disappeared down the deep hallway on the East Tower's second floor, a single foot suddenly became visible at the edge of the darkness. But its invisible owner remained hidden outside. A low click of the tongue echoed through the corridor. That foot eventually withdrew from the shadow and vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, Saul and Kanksha had already arrived at the first floor of the East Tower, before a great bronze door. The bronze door was ancient and heavy, but the arcane formations etched onto its surface gave it an eerie feeling. Kanksha stood before the door, lips pressed tight, looking serious, maybe even a bit nervous. Saul, being the one with the key, felt no pressure from the door at all. Senior Kanksha, Saul said, standing at the door, it's almost 3. Kanksha lifted her head. A few eyeballs popped out, warily staring at the bronze door. Then she spoke quickly. What I need is item number 117, Whisper of the Elves. Saul's expression darkened at once. Senior Kanksha, anything with a serial number is a taboo item. I'm not even allowed to use them, let alone bring them out for someone else. One of Kongsha's eyeballs turned to look directly at Saul. I know, I won't take it out. I'll go in and use it myself. That way, you won't have to touch the taboo item or smuggle anything out. Then by all means, I'll just pretend I was late for work. Saul didn't believe it would be that simple. He even moved aside to make room and closed his eyes as if playing dumb. I can't get in, but you can bring me in. Bring you in, Saul knew he could technically. Just like Kujin had brought him in. And if the person he brought turned hostile, Saul could use the key to eject them instantly. But there was a risk. If the other party acted fast enough to grab the item before he reacted, the second warehouse could suffer. So, Senior Kongsha, how can I be sure you won't pull anything extra once you're inside? If the benefit was high enough, Saul didn't mind taking the risk. That was because of the mutual trust built over years of working with Kongsha. If it were someone like Ferguson or Kujin, Saul wouldn't even consider it. Whisper of the Elves is a green conch, about the size of a fist. You can't use it, but you can move it. I move it to the inner side of the door, and you use it there. Yes. This way, even if Kongsha wanted to enter the warehouse's interior, she couldn't open the second door. And if she tried to steal the conch, she'd be risking her life and offending the tower master. That might be worth trying. So what price is Senior Kongsha offering for me to take this risk again? A locator, Kongsha replied. Now that you've reached second rank, once you stabilize, you'll need to think about your locator. I can offer you 2 relatively safe locator configurations. I know your mental aptitude is excellent, but magic has always been your weakness, so you either keep pushing your mental strength or use the locator to forcibly boost your magic. Oh, by the way, have you broken past 55 joules yet? If your magic is too low, no need to rush the locator. Saul just passed 80 joules. Kongsha. Kongsha, why is it always me who gets hurt? Chapter 171, The Ticklish Flesh. The most terrifying thing is when the air suddenly falls silent for too long. Seeing Kongsha remain quiet, Saul grew a little anxious. After all, his eyes were still wrapped in bandages. It seems my worries were unnecessary. In that case, Kongsha suddenly found herself hesitant to give Saul any suggestions. She rephrased, if you're interested in a method to strengthen your mental force, I can take you to a place. There, you'll definitely find a suitable locator. Locator. Saul already had his diary, but so far, he hadn't figured out how to turn it into his locator. If he could borrow from other locator designs, that wouldn't be a bad thing either. It might help broaden his thinking. Senior Kongsha, aren't locators hard to find? Is the place you're talking about particularly dangerous? Yes, but only dangerous places yield powerful locators. Saul, you are indeed exceptional. But if you want to continue on the path of becoming a wizard, you can't be satisfied with your current accomplishments. Sometimes, when you just want to stop and catch your breath, you'll find that by the time you're ready to move again, you'll never catch up. The eyeballs inside Kongsha's head slowly withdrew, as if sharing in her somber mood. Could this be Senior Kongsha's own personal experience? Saul pondered. Sorry, I still need to think it over. Though tempted, Saul didn't immediately agree. Kongsha's shoulders slumped slightly. I can give you the locator blueprint first. Even if you don't use it, you can sell it to others at a high price. For second-rank apprentices, locators have always been one of the rarest resources. Sure enough, the second vault was a hot spot. Saul hadn't even warmed his seat before people were already eyeing him. Now, Ferguson openly wanted the candle, and Kongsha wanted the item labeled number 117, Elven Whispers. The first item, according to Kujin, appeared useless but was in fact highly valuable. If Saul took it out, they'd gain leverage over him, allowing Kujin and his people to coerce him. The second item had been explicitly warned against by Senior Byron. No one below third rank should touch elven artifacts. Saul found it strange. Their spell system clearly included Elvish as a language, so why were elf-related items considered taboo? But back then, Saul had been too weak, lacking the strength and qualifications to investigate. Now he had an opportunity to understand more. But until he was sure, he would never carry elven items on his person like Concha or Seed. Just that elf doll alone, one that made any apprentice afraid to even stir their mental force, was enough to stir Saul's curiosity. Wasn't that basically a wizard-killing weapon? In that case, Senior Concha, if I'm ready within 10 days, I'll meet you at the agreed time in the dormitory. Saul wasn't brushing her off. If he didn't want to work with her, he would have set a much longer timeline so she'd give up hope. 10 days meant he was seriously considering it. At 5 minutes past 3, Saul finally returned to the second vault. He first went to check the communication pen. No new assignments today. Then he turned and passed through the sea of corpses, heading toward the wall to confirm how many candle lamps were lit. 91. That number was a little risky. Saul quickly increased it to over 100. He held up the lighting tool and waited for a moment. No candles flickered out. Saul nodded in satisfaction. No wonder Cugin said the second vault is the safest place. This task is pretty easy to manage. The next moment, Saul, having diligently lit the candles, put away his lighting tool, grabbed a large box, and dragged it under one of the unlit candle lamps. He held a beaker in his left hand and a small knife in his right, climbing onto the box. Standing on top, Saul's line of sight was level with the candle lamp. Using the small knife, he sliced off a small piece of the candle and dropped it into the beaker positioned under the lamp. He crouched down to place the knife and beaker by his feet, then stood up again and took out the lighting tool to ignite the candle. As expected, the candle lit up, though it was visibly shorter than the others in the vault. Saul looked back and surveyed the vault. All the candles were the same height. Only the one he had cut was shorter. The candles in the wizard tower always remain lit, never going out, and no one is ever seen replacing them. Yet the height remains uniform, as if precisely measured by a machine. Saul jumped down from the box, picked up the beaker and knife, and returned to the long table. I used to think some servant or apprentice was responsible for replacing the candles, but only the tower master and I can freely enter the second vault. No one else can get in, so this has to be a result of wizardry. Thinking this, Saul suddenly put down the beaker, grabbed the knife again, and ran back to the box. He dragged the box to a damaged candle lamp that had no candle in it, climbed up, and forcefully pried the lamp from the wall with the knife. The base of the candle lamp was secured to the wall with 6 long iron nails. Even with Saul's strength, it took considerable effort to wrench one free. The loosened iron nails clattered to the ground. Saul transferred both the knife and the lamp to his left hand and pressed his right hand against the wall, leaning in to inspect the hole exposed beneath the lamp. In the wall below the base was a small hole about 1 centimeter in diameter, too dark to see inside. Saul gently moved his fingertip to the edge. Gleam light. A warm, magical glow lit up the inside of the hole. Inside wasn't rough earthen wall or smooth metal piping, but a wrinkly, fleshy texture, something like blood vessels or intestines. At the bottom of the blood vessel was a thin layer of dried white substance. Saul immediately turned to look at the damaged candle lamp in his hand. Sure enough, there was also a layer of that same white substance on the bottom. Could these be the same material? Curious, Saul tried to scrape some of the white substance from the pipe using the knife. But the blade was too wide and the material too deep in the tube. Unless he broke the wall, he couldn't reach it. He was about to fetch a needle or tweezers when he suddenly muttered to himself, "If I touch it, will it be dangerous?" No response from the diary. He answered his own question, shouldn't be dangerous. Candles are everywhere in the tower, and the rulebook only says not to extinguish them. It doesn't mention touching. My job often requires handling candles, so accidents could happen. If touching them were dangerous, the rules would have said so. With that thought, Saul reached in and gently scraped a bit of the white substance with his fingertip. Just as he curled his finger, he suddenly felt the pipe twitch. It was like someone getting tickled, a sudden, involuntary shudder. The movement was so slight Saul thought he imagined it. He reached in again, no response. Then, like scratching an itch, he gently trailed his finger along the inner wall of the pipe. Suddenly, it twitched again. This time, Saul was prepared and saw it clearly. The pipe was alive, and it had ticklish spots. With a complicated expression, Saul carefully reattached the removed candle lamp. He'd also collected some of the white substance, but dared not tamper further with the blood vessel. Afterward, he carried the materials back to the long table. Now he cleared a small space on the messy table. Laid out in front of him were a candle stub, the white substance from the pipe, and the residue from the candle lamp. Saul carefully extracted a bit of each and ran a series of basic tests. After several rounds, the three samples all showed identical properties, almost certainly the same substance, candle wax. So the candles in the lamp are supplied by these tubes. That's why they don't require manual maintenance and never burn out. The vault's candles are just like those outside, except they can extinguish, but the wax itself never diminishes, so there must be living pipes under every candle lamp elsewhere too. At this thought, Saul suddenly felt a chill. He looked around. Could it be we're actually living inside some kind of creature? The cold vault housed all manner of materials. Many were biological limbs. Even though the cuts were clean and smooth, they did little to hide the pain the creatures must have endured. All the cruelty, blood, and darkness hidden beneath neatly carved stone slabs. Is the Wizard Tower a synthetic life form, one that entombs countless living beings? Countless lives, countless grudges. That's why the Wizard Tower must never fall into darkness. Because in darkness, slumbering fear awakens. Chapter 172, The Candle's Composition. The pipeline behind the candlestick made Saul's hair stand on end, but it wasn't enough to stop him from continuing his experiments. Ferguson might be scheming against him, but the offer he proposed was truly tempting. Saul lacked magic crystals, lacked credits, and lacked all kinds of rare experimental materials. On top of that, he had plenty of problems on his hands. Solving those would require deep research, which meant a whole new set of expenses. Since Ferguson and Cugin were plotting against him and tossed out a sugar-coated bullet, why couldn't Saul just swallow the sugar coating and throw the bullet right back? He didn't know the true value of the real candle, but he figured he could at least make a convincing fake. After all, Ferguson only wanted the candle as leverage, not for actual use. As long as it looked passable, it should be enough. Of course, passable still had to be a high-quality imitation. If it looked fake at a glance, there'd be no sugar to enjoy. No sooner thought than done. Saul immediately began reverse engineering the candle's properties to start crafting a replica. First, he listed all of the candle's observed characteristics, then worked backward to deduce the possible substances it might contain, even deriving and calculating synthetic reaction formulas. This round of deductions had him working straight through the night. The mental strain left him thoroughly exhausted, and he didn't feel like using meditation to replace sleep. The cocoon of the nightmare butterfly has already been extracted and sealed. No strange activity. Might as well use this chance to sleep and see whether the cocoon still affects me. Reassuring himself, Saul lay down on the low bed beside the long table. The bed had originally belonged to Cugin. It was too big to move easily, so Cugin had simply left it behind. Saul had swapped out the bedding and kept using it. Before going to sleep, he removed the gauze. His left eye was still a grayish haze, unable to see clearly. Looks like I really will need someone to use advanced healing magic. Hope it's not too expensive to fix an eye. Saul slowly closed his eyes. Please, no dreams tonight. He quickly fell asleep. But while he slept soundly, others were tossing and turning, unable to rest. The powerful third-rank apprentices, Cugin and Ferguson, had secretly gathered again to discuss tomorrow's moves. Concha, her beauty now marred, curled up under her bed, both eager and afraid of what the future might bring. Angela, freshly marked with Saul's five-fingered seal, wandered the night-shrouded West Tower with her mask on. And the usually silent, tomb-like library was unusually lively tonight. The three librarians, young, middle-aged, and old, had come together for the first time in ages. "You're sure?" the young one asked nervously. "I'm sure," the old man replied, raising his hand. All 10 of his fingers were missing part of the first knuckle, and they still hadn't regrown. The young man's eyes lit up, then blurred with tears. We have a chance to get out." But the middle-aged man threw cold water over their hope. "You're crazy, all of you. There's no way we can escape." He looked terrified, glancing left and right as he spoke, as if scared someone would suddenly appear behind them, watching coldly. The young man sneered at him. "Afraid? What is there to be afraid of? What, he gonna kill us again?" Just hearing the word, he made the middle-aged man tremble all over. The old man ignored his cowardice and stroked his beard. "I have an idea. Tomorrow, we send someone to test him." The young one blinked. "Didn't you already test him?" The old man steeled himself. "This time we test harder, push our way right out." The middle-aged man screamed and leapt into the air, passing through the ceiling and crashing back down. "You're insane, completely insane." But the young man grinned with twisted excitement. "Let's do it. Who's going?" The old man stood up, hands clasped behind his back. "I will." The young man smirked but didn't object. Only the middle-aged one kept muttering, lips trembling. "Insane, all of you are insane." What? The morning sun could not reach the darkness of the wizard tower. Saul had a dreamless night and slept wonderfully. He shot upright, feeling refreshed and clear-headed. Even the gloomy storage room looked a little cuter today. He stood and prepared to tidy up and return to his experiments. But when he saw the experimental records on the table, he suddenly felt something was off with his field of view. He raised a hand to his eye, then closed his right eye to look around. To his surprise, he found that his left eye had already recovered its vision. He quickly grabbed the reflective side of a knife on the table and checked his reflection. His eye had returned to normal, and the color was black again. "What, my body can self-heal now?" Saul rushed over to check the sealed test tube holding the cocoon. When he saw the small silver sphere floating slowly up and down, he let out a deep sigh of relief. Thank goodness the cocoon hadn't returned to his eye, or everything he did yesterday would have been for nothing. Since his eye hadn't healed due to the cocoon, then had someone secretly healed him? Or was it, as he had suspected, his body was regenerating on its own? Only 2 people could enter the second storage room freely: Saul himself and the Wizard Tower's master, Gorsa. Gorsa certainly had the ability, but he typically never interfered with Saul's studies or research. He clearly preferred to let him grow independently. In that case, self-regeneration seemed the more likely answer. With that in mind, Saul picked up the knife, gave it a quick disinfecting wipe, and then rolled up his sleeve to cut 3 wounds into his right arm. The wounds varied in depth. After quickly disinfecting and stopping the bleeding, he wrapped them with gauze. Then he carefully noted the time and wound conditions, intending to study whether his body really had regenerative properties. With that done, his focus shifted back to the candle. Yesterday, he had basically broken down the ingredients of the endlessly burning candles throughout the Wizard Tower. By comparing his findings with experimental notes he'd kept over the years, he'd actually identified one of the main ingredients: the nectar of the symbiotic flower. However, the composition of this nectar slightly differed from the data in his notes. He couldn't tell whether that was due to experimental error or natural variance in the plant's makeup. After all, the symbiotic flower was a broad category, with subtypes used for things like poison crafting, magic enhancement, mental stabilization, and more. Saul had owned several symbiotic flowers himself, and still had quite a few petals saved. He immediately took 2 petals from different function types and ran another component analysis. This time, the 2 resulting data sets were slightly different from each other and from the candle, but the overall trend was consistent. If both new sets show the same pattern of differences, I can conclude the ingredient is indeed a symbiotic flower. To ensure reliability, Saul gritted his teeth and pulled out another 2 petals of the same types and ran the tests again. The results were consistent with the first run. The difference between the sets was consistent as well. Saul picked up the analysis sheet for the candle. So the flower used in these candles is a type I haven't cultivated. He stared at the data sheets for several minutes, then suddenly scribbled the words mental stabilization on a fresh sheet and drew a big question mark next to it. The flower added to the candle is probably one that stabilizes mental entities. That's why the Wizard Tower has been cultivating and buying this plant all along. The candles spread across the Wizard Tower were all being used to stabilize one or several mental entities. If that's their function, they're indeed important. But taking a small piece shouldn't affect the candle's performance. If Kyujin wanted to use the candle to threaten me, he'd at least demand a complete one. Still, though he had confirmed one of the primary ingredients, he had yet to identify the second. If he couldn't produce a convincing candle by this afternoon, he'd have to turn down Ferguson's offer. And with Ferguson's twisted body, who knew what he might do if pushed to desperation? Saul wasn't afraid, but that sugar coating would definitely slip away. What's the other main ingredient, or what could be used to imitate its effects? Pipe-like structures resembling blood vessels or intestines, white substances being transported inside the candle, automatically repairing itself when burned and melted. Saul's spinning pen suddenly stopped as his gaze fell on the 3 small cuts he had made on his arm. Chapter 173. Wanna give it a try. High-quality imitation outshines the original. He acted without hesitation. Saul inflicted a 4th wound on himself and collected a bit of blood and muscle tissue. Then, using the basic materials for making candles, along with the juice of the parasitic flower, his own flesh and blood, and a small piece cut from one of the existing candles, he crafted a new, complete candle. This candle looked very similar to the ones on the candelabrum, but due to the added flesh and blood, its color had changed from white to red. I already diluted it as much as I could, and it's still this red. Should I have extracted serum or used other colorless tissues instead? Although the first finished product had a color issue, Saul decided to test it anyway. He fixed the candle onto the table and flicked a small flame at the wick. However, the little flame drifted past the wick without igniting it. Is there something wrong with the material? Could it have affected flammability? Wait a second. Saul then took out an igniter, stepped back a bit, and aimed the nozzle at the wick. Hiss! This time the red candle caught fire smoothly, the wick burning with a ghostly white flame. It's exactly the same as the flames on the candelabrum. Saul compared it carefully with the overhead candlelight and grinned in delight. Did I really get it right on the first try? Am I this much of a genius? After a brief moment of joy, Saul calmed himself down. Most of the components are substitutes, and the parasitic flower juice isn't exactly right either, so the actual effect might differ significantly. Suddenly, a chill ran down Saul's spine. Goosebumps burst out over his entire body, as if they had a will of their own. He spun around in shock, only to see the aisles between the shelves packed with people. All of them were the corpses from outside. Somehow they had silently moved behind him. Some squeezed into the narrow aisles, while others, unable to fit, stood behind the shelves, watching Saul through the gaps in the goods. But Saul could feel they weren't looking at him. They were staring at the candle in his hand. Just a brief lapse in attention, and the horde seemed to have crept even closer. Without hesitation, Saul picked up the knife from the table and snuffed out the flame. As a wisp of blue smoke rose from the scorched wick, that eerie sense of being watched slowly faded. Saul looked back again, and keenly noticed the corpses had inched closer. Though their faces remained expressionless and their eyes tightly shut, Saul could sense a distinct emotion: disappointment. He'd always known they retained a sliver of awareness, but this was the first time they'd ever moved on their own. He hadn't expected the red candle to provoke such a reaction. Staring at the candle in his hand, Saul muttered to himself, "Did I just create something extraordinary?" "What thing?" A female voice suddenly echoed above his head. Looking up, Saul saw a black shadow seeping from the ceiling, its viscous, droplet-like form gradually stretching and unfolding into the shape of a woman. Finally, the shadow fully detached from the roof and landed softly on the floor, nearly overlapping with Saul's own figure. "Lady Yura." "Don't call me Yura, call me Vinny," the shadow snapped, displeased. But she quickly brushed past the matter and with a face that lacked clear features sniffed left and right. "Where did that scent go?" "Scent?" Saul looked down at the red candle beside him. He hadn't smelled anything at all. The shadow immediately caught his line of sight and followed it to the candle. "This is something you made." Vinny's shadow leaned in closer, crouching down and folding her arms on the table to meet the candle at eye level. "I feel like its scent brings peace." The shadow seemed to tilt her head upward. "Can you light it again?" "Peace?" That was odd. Saul hadn't added anything meant to calm or soothe souls. Even the parasitic flower juice, which might normally stabilize the mental body, had been diluted several times. By logic, it should be far less effective than the original white candles. Yet Vinny had shown no reaction to the other burning candles in the storeroom. "Vinny, if I light the candle, those guys might rush me." Saul pointed at the corpse horde still wandering by the shelves. The shadow glanced back indifferently. "It's fine. They're only here because they feel good. As long as you don't violate the taboo, they won't hurt you. Come on, hurry up." With her reassurance, Saul picked up the igniter and lit the red candle again. A faint white glow flared to life. Silence fell over the storeroom. Both the living and the dead stared blankly at the flame. Saul didn't smell anything or feel especially calm. Looking around, he noticed the corpses hadn't moved closer, but each of them now faced the candle directly. Their faces were less ghastly and more entranced. "I mustn't let them know the raw material was my blood," Saul thought uneasily, pressing a hand against the wound hidden beneath his sleeve. "They don't react to my wound, but they're drawn to the red candle. This must be some kind of wizardly-induced transformation. But why does my blood produce this effect? Could it be related to the way my left eye regenerates?" In his memory, the only major change to his body happened after he defeated the Wraith Morden, when his entire body melted while he was unconscious. It was Senior Byron who later told him about that event. Saul had no recollection of it. When Byron examined him afterward, he found no explanation for the fusion and regeneration. But with enemies possibly still in pursuit, they shelved the issue for later. After returning to the Wizard Tower, Saul didn't notice any abnormalities either. But in hindsight, that incident clearly left a deep impact. Whether it was good or bad, or if there were hidden drawbacks, remained to be seen. While Saul fretted over his body's changes, Vinnie was completely entranced by the red candle. She had even sat down on the floor, arms resting on the table, her head nestled into them. She looked about ready to fall asleep. "How come you can make a candle like this, but Gorsa can only produce those foul-smelling white ones? I always said he didn't really understand souls." Hearing her complain about the tower master, Saul could only rub his nose and pretend he didn't hear anything. But Vinnie kept going, even launching into a biography of Gorsa. Back when Gorsa had just established the Wizard Tower, the Western continent was in chaos. Refugees from the Westland founded Badon Academy along the coast. Backed by the sea, they ignored the Western Treaty and often bullied the Kemah Empire, trying to expand their territory. To avoid losing land, or even the empire, Kemah's emperor had sent people everywhere to investigate the backgrounds of newly arrived wizards, hoping to find a reliable ally. As soon as word got out, the newly settled Wizard Tower Master Gorsa proactively came forward to propose an alliance. At the time, many powers were moving into the Western continent. Gorsa arrived alone, yet managed to carve out a large swath of land. Rumor had it his family was powerful on another continent, so none of the other factions dared to challenge him. The Kemah Empire's people were probably deceived by him, Vinnie said, head tilted in annoyance. Gorsa was most likely exiled by his family. All these years, no one from any other faction has come looking for him. Out of guilt, he sought an alliance with Kemah. So that's why he married Lady Yura. Not exactly. The Kemah Emperor, now merely a duke, lowered himself to form the alliance. In addition to providing yearly supplies to the Wizard Tower, they also proposed a traditional noble marriage. But Gorsa refused the political marriage. Instead, he had the Empire send someone to manage the territory for him, only asking for tribute every year. Saul was surprised, but then realized it sounded just like something the Tower Master would do. If Gorsa truly came alone to the Western lands, he probably didn't have the time or energy to manage internal affairs. But Saul hadn't expected him to not even appoint a steward, instead handing the land back to its former rulers to administer. The Kemah Empire must have been thrilled. Even managing just part of that land would help them recover significantly. Then how did Lady Yura end up marrying the Tower Master? Saul wasn't trying to gossip. Yura's death clearly tied into Gorsa's true motives. Was his research really aimed at resurrecting his lover, or was it to resist the contamination? Only by understanding the nature and goal of the experiments could he properly plan the next steps. At the time, Yura was already a first-rank true wizard, specializing in dark element magic and obsessed with soul studies. Vinnie remained entranced by the red candle. Gorsa, on the other hand, specialized in light element magic. The moment they met, they argued over one topic. Saul's ears perked up. What topic? Whether the soul can exist independently of the body. Chapter 174, Blending. A soul existing independently. Isn't that just a ghost? Images of the bizarre apparitions he'd seen in the Wizard Tower flashed through Saul's mind. Of course not that kind, Vinnie grew agitated. I'm talking about a complete, independent and conscious soul, not some corrupted, fractured remnant driven mad by the unknown. But as she stared at the red candle, her head gradually tilted downward again. They argued for a long time, neither able to convince the other, so Gorsa took Yura away. Haha, the Kemah Empire immediately announced to the public that the two had married. And which view did the Tower Master and Lady Yura support? Vinnie didn't answer right away. The red candle had already burned down by a third, its white flame unnaturally steady. They really did become a couple, but one day, Yura woke up and found herself strapped to a dark laboratory table. Gorsa had personally opened her skull and flayed her skin to make a kind of pink bandage. At this point, Vinny slowly stood up. She turned her head towards Saul. Through the black silhouette, Saul could faintly make out a tragic smile. Gorsa hid the skull and wrapped himself in the pink bandage infused with hatred, sorrow, and fear. That way, he could hold out a little longer. Vinny suddenly extended her hand and pressed it into the white flame. Shockingly, she extinguished it. "It smells pleasant, but it only brings temporary peace," Vinny said, withdrawing her hand. Her flat head suddenly twisted 90 degrees to stare at Saul. "Tell me, if one day Lady Yura's skull and skin are no longer usable, what do you think Gorsa will do?" Saul didn't answer. "Hey, Vinny laughed maniacally as her figure gradually faded and vanished from Saul's sight. Saul stood there silently for nearly 10 minutes before narrowing his eyes and scanning the area. The red candle had gone out. At some point, the corpse horde had returned to their original positions. Vinny's shadow was completely gone. She must have returned to Gorsa's side. Though she was bound to Gorsa, Vinny still had a certain degree of autonomy. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to share all this today. Still, it was impossible to determine the truth or motive behind her words. Saul picked up the red candle on the table. "Vinny, she's actually Lady Yura, isn't she? She just refuses to acknowledge it." Tucking the candle away, he also checked the 4 wounds on his arm. Unfortunately, not one had healed. His eyes had recovered, but there must have been another factor involved. At 2:00 p.m., Saul went to Kyujin's dormitory. Kyujin was indeed waiting there. "Senior Kyujin, please inform Ferguson. At 2:55 p.m., be ready with enough magic crystals and wait for me at the outermost metal gate on the first floor of the East Tower. If he's late, I'll consider the deal off." Kyujin was stunned, but before he could respond, Saul turned and left, giving no room for negotiation. Kyujin glared at Saul's back for a long while before heading off elsewhere. Afterward, Saul went to Mentor Kaz's laboratory. Angela, still working there, was so startled at the sight of Saul that she jumped right out of her chair. "I brought food today." Saul smiled and nodded. "Thanks, but I'm not hungry." He walked to one of the cabinets inside the lab, opened it, and pulled out a puppet doll before returning to Angela. "Renting a doll." Angela instinctively stepped back half a pace. "Okay." Money changed hands, and so did the doll. After that, Saul wandered around the tower for a while longer. He visited Wright, then Byron. Finally, he returned to his dorm, but unfortunately, Kelly still hadn't come back. He wondered if she'd be shocked to see him when she returned. Saul lingered for quite a while before heading to the second storeroom at exactly 2:55 p.m. Ferguson was already there. It was unclear how long he'd been waiting, but he looked visibly anxious. "You're finally here," Ferguson said, barely masking his irritation. Saul didn't bother with pleasantries. "What do you want, Senior?" Ferguson hesitated at Saul's directness. Having second thoughts, "I don't mind calling it off now," Saul said. "I won't make things hard for you. This is your first time after all. I need one of the candles from the storeroom, not just a stub, but a full stick from a candelabrum. They don't have an ID number and there are a lot of them in there. I doubt you'd be too scared to take one." Saul crossed his arms and thought for a moment. If it's so simple, why not just grab one from the hallway? "The hallway ones are completely different." Ferguson lowered his voice. "They're inspected daily. The ones in the storeroom, only you know about them." Saul didn't press for details. 500 magic crystals." "No way," Ferguson growled, eyes flickering with arcane sparks. "It's just a candle. I'll give you 200 at most." 500, Saul repeated, holding out his hand. "Or we're done." Ferguson's cheek twitched, but he finally pulled out a pouch of crystals and a vial of potion. I didn't bring that many. This is a bottle of phantasmic vision potion, worth at least 150. Saul took the pouch and swept it with his mental power. The magic energy inside was pure, roughly 400 crystals plus the potion. That did add up to more than 500. Ferguson's generosity likely meant he intended to use this to blackmail Saul in the future. Saul was satisfied and stowed the items. Wait here. He headed deep into the second storeroom, circling the reassembled corpse horde. He also counted the lit candelabras on the wall, still more than 100, before timing his exit. When Saul opened the right side metal door again, Ferguson stood with his eyes closed. Arcs of lightning sparked across his body, radiating the oppressive aura of a third-rank apprentice. But having witnessed the strength of Byron, Bill, and even Herman, Saul found Ferguson lacking in comparison. He approached and handed the box to Ferguson. Ferguson sensed someone and opened his eyes, immediately seeing the box held out before him. He snatched it, scanning it with both magic and mental power. Detecting no abnormalities, he cautiously opened a corner. "Why is it red?" "A disguise," Saul replied. Ferguson had a bad feeling. "I want to inspect it on the spot." Here, Saul narrowed his eyes, pretending to be impatient. "The darkness here makes it impossible to hide tricks. It's the safest place to verify." Ferguson pulled out a miniature lighter and lit the candle inside the box. FSSHH. The red candle instantly ignited with a white flame. He stared at it closely. Once he confirmed the white flame was authentic, he finally relaxed. "At least you're honest." Having secured the contraband, Ferguson finally allowed a smile to creep across his face. But just as he looked up, preparing to teach this greedy newcomer a lesson, he was met with countless human faces. Ferguson's hand trembled, nearly dropping the box. Surrounding him were pale-faced corpses with closed eyes. The corpse horde. As someone who'd privately collaborated with Cugin, Ferguson naturally knew what these corpses were. They were one of the taboos of the second storeroom. Each one displayed here had a designated number. Each was once a powerful apprentice, even a true wizard. Every one of them was a forbidden existence. Ferguson didn't even dare to breathe. He could only frantically dart his eyes around, hopping to find a way out. Suddenly, his rapidly moving eyes froze. There in the center of the horde stood Saul, the only one with open eyes, silently watching him. Chapter 175. Accidents Abound. Saul was actually more panicked than Ferguson. He had once experienced a scene where a horde of corpses gathered, and he knew that as long as no taboos were violated, there generally wouldn't be any danger. What panicked him was, how did these corpses manage to get outside the storage room? Had the taboos of the storage room failed, or was it a mistake on his part? Before figuring out the truth, he wouldn't make any rash moves. Saul simply pretended he was just one of the corpses, silently watching Ferguson. Hidden among the horde, Saul had no idea what Ferguson had just experienced in those few short seconds. Ferguson had just tried to flee the scene with the red candle when suddenly, a massive axe came crashing down from above, splitting his head in two. In the blink of an eye, he was back in the dark corridor, standing upright again. He realized everything just now had been an illusion. But before he could react, the ground beneath his feet turned into a mire. No matter how he struggled, he couldn't break free, and in the end, he was forced to watch the sludge pour into his mouth and nose, submerging even the top of his skull. Just before suffocating, Ferguson snapped out of it once more. But then he was run through the heart with a blade, devoured alive by countless bugs, and endlessly wandered in darkness until he was utterly lost. He struggled through countless deaths, barely returning to reality each time, only to be pulled back into the abyss. Just as he was on the verge of going insane, a surge of white lightning burst out and enveloped his entire body. No! Ferguson's eyes snapped open wide. His consciousness had finally returned to reality. The pale faces of the corpses were now just inches from his own. He immediately raised both hands, the white lightning converging into two long whips. With a snap of his wrists, the current lashed out, striking the surrounding corpses. The powerful electric field instantly dispelled the illusion cast by the corpse horde. However, the terrifying electric whips that crackled with power only left charred marks on the corpses. They didn't even force the horde back a single step. As Ferguson lashed out, the box containing the red candle fell to the ground. The candle rolled out, its white flame curling upward, burning steadily and undisturbed. While moving, Ferguson accidentally kicked the candle. It rolled into a corner, and in that instant the entire horde shifted its attention toward it. Only then did Ferguson realize the candle was the cause of the corpse's unrest. "Saul!" he shouted angrily at the boy hidden among the corpses, then lashed out with the electric whip, aiming directly at him. Seeing the white lightning headed straight for him, Saul felt every hair on his body stand on end. He immediately twisted his body to the side, ducking behind a nearby corpse. Snap! The corpse took the hit for Saul, but the current still conducted through its body, making Saul go numb all over. "Ferguson, it was an accident. How was I supposed to know lighting the candle outside would cause this?" As he spoke, Saul bolted toward the candle. As long as he could extinguish it, the corpses should return to normal. Ferguson didn't know what Saul intended, but when he saw him running toward the candle, his first thought was, he's trying to steal it. He no longer cared whether the battle would further provoke the corpses. The thick electric whips lashed out like snakes baring their fangs, ready to strike Saul. Saul squeezed through the crowd of corpses like a shopper in a packed market. A bolt of lightning landed just in front of him. Though most of it was blocked by the corpses, the residual charge still numbed his entire body. The next second, a transparent barrier enveloped Saul, blocking out the current completely. "Ferguson, are you trying to kill me?" If Saul hadn't activated the soul armor scroll at the last second, he would have been injured by the attack. Electricity was still a weakness in Saul's spell system, one he hadn't overcome yet. Thankfully, he hadn't reforged his soul resin, or else his arm might have melted again. "As long as you don't act rashly," Ferguson said coldly, seeing that Saul was trapped inside the soul armor. He carefully wove through the corpse horde, trying to retrieve the candle from the corner. Electric sparks still danced around his body, warding off further illusions. A large amount of electricity gathered in his lower body, causing his facial muscles to twitch with every step. It looked painful. But instead, Ferguson sped up, his eyes growing more frenzied as he stared at the candle beneath the corpses. He knew that the candle from the second storage room was something very important. What he didn't know was that it could summon the corpses. There was no way he was handing this over to Kujin now. Used properly, it might be his ticket to a full comeback. He also realized that, after the corpses assaulted his mind at first, they had only been chasing the candle. So Ferguson stopped attacking them, focusing instead on carefully clearing a path. He tried to use Mage Hand to grab the candle directly, but as soon as the spectral hand passed through the corpses, it began to be absorbed. By the time it reached the candle, only a single finger remained. As Ferguson cautiously approached the candle, Saul's soul armor began to dissipate. Instead of imitating Ferguson's advance, Saul walked back to the edge of the bronze door. Seeing Saul voluntarily retreat, Ferguson, who had been watching him out of the corner of his eye, sneered to himself, "At least he knows his place. That little bastard embarrassed me and forced me to activate my locator. Once I get that candle back, I'm going to make him pay." Let's see if he still dares play tricks. Ferguson had completely forgotten. He was the one who insisted on lighting the candle here in the first place. Just 2 rows of corpses away from the candle. Suddenly, a black tendril the thickness of a finger snaked its way through the crowd, winding between limbs and swiftly snatching the candle. Ferguson was shocked, a tendril of the soul-devouring mire. He wasn't afraid of it, but the tendril was incredibly quick and agile. After grabbing the candle, it immediately withdrew through the gaps, dragging the corpse horde out of place with it. The candle that had just been within reach was now gone. Ferguson turned to see the tendril connected to Saul. Knew it was you causing trouble. He wanted nothing more than to fry Saul into charcoal. But seeing the candle closer to himself than Saul, Ferguson chose to go after it first. He didn't care if he fell back into another illusion. He dove in head first, shoving corpses aside and springing into the air like he had springs on his feet. But just as he jumped, another sneaky black tendril emerged and tugged at his foot, throwing him off balance. He struck with his whip instantly, dissolving the tendril on contact. But that tiny delay was enough. He hadn't jumped far. All he could do was watch as the sneaky black tendril thief carried the red candle back to Saul. Saul reached out and caught the candle. Even after all the chaos, the flame remained bright. Looking up, he saw Ferguson just 3 meters away, behind a few corpses. Ferguson glared darkly at Saul. "Give me the candle." Saul placed a hand on the metal door behind him, expression grim. "Senior, this candle clearly isn't as simple as you said. If I just hand it over, the consequences could be serious. I need to reconsider this transaction." "You're going back on your word," Ferguson snapped, lashing the whip in anger. Saul chuckled. "Isn't it you who withheld information?" Ferguson's lips tightened. His fingers creaked from clenching so hard. Saul hadn't expected that lighting the counterfeit candle outside would draw the corpse horde out. The situation had gone beyond his control. This deal had to be called off. If this item fell into the wrong hands, not even Saul knew what disaster it might cause. Most importantly, if anything went wrong with the horde, Saul wouldn't escape blame. That would completely go against the original deal he made after taking the sugar-coated bait. It was like getting a single piece of candy, only to be forced to return 10. Chapter 176. A total loss. "You guys are the cruel ones." Ferguson stepped forward again, his eyes already filled with killing intent. Saul quickly reached back and pushed the door open just a crack. "No need to get angry, Senior. I still need to study this candle a bit more just to avoid any trouble for either of us. Besides, even if this deal falls through, we can still talk about other materials, right?" Ferguson, who had been on the verge of going berserk, suddenly calmed down. The candle's unexpected function had made him momentarily forget his original purpose. The candle was merely bait to control Saul. What he truly needed to save his life was still inside the second storage room. "Then give me back the magic crystals." Ferguson stretched out a hand expressionlessly. "All right, I'll go get them now." Saul smiled, turned his head and froze on the spot, completely motionless. Ferguson saw Saul agree verbally but stand there unmoving, and he immediately felt like he was being toyed with again. 500 magic crystals weren't crippling for a third-rank apprentice, but it wasn't a small amount either. If Saul dared to steal them, Ferguson would block the door and beat him half to death if he had to. Ferguson urged him, but Saul still didn't move. He strode forward and shook his arm threateningly. "If not, then give me the candle." As soon as he spoke, the nearly furious Ferguson finally noticed something was off. Through the crack in the bronze door Saul had pushed open, a multicolored light glowed within. The shimmering hues rippled like water, dazzling and mesmerizing. "The inside of the bronze door looks like this. I don't remember Cugin ever mentioning it." Ferguson wasn't the warehouse manager, after all, and Kyujin wouldn't have told him everything. So he failed to notice one critical detail. Saul's hand had only pushed on the right side of the bronze door, but both panels of the door had opened inward at the same time. Saul dared not move. Though Mentor Kaz had only explained the rules to him once, he remembered every single one clearly. When opening the first metal door, only the left or right panel could be pushed open, never both. If both sides were opened simultaneously, one must immediately freeze in place until the door closed again. So the moment Saul turned and saw both doors opening inward, he instantly froze and didn't dare move a muscle. Even when Ferguson moved in and snatched the red candle from his hand, Saul remained motionless. Like a statue. Ferguson also felt that something was off, but couldn't quite put his finger on what. "I'm taking the candle. Next time we trade, I will go." Saul stared blankly at Ferguson in front of him. Ferguson stood there, holding the red candle in his hand, his lips still moving. But he didn't realize that his lips were moving slower and slower, his voice growing increasingly muffled. From Saul's perspective, inside the now-open bronze door, slender white arms extended out. Each of those arms had long, noodle-like fingers, soft and limp, like pasta that had been boiled for hours. Yet they were firm and strong, wrapping around Ferguson's body again and again, slowly pulling him into the door. Ferguson remained completely unaware, still mouthing words. The noodle-like fingers slid into his mouth, his nostrils, his ears. Saul couldn't hear a word of it. Watching Ferguson gradually mummified by the noodles, Saul didn't dare move, only his eyes trembling slightly. He shifted his gaze toward the edge of his vision and vaguely saw Ferguson's body going limp, being slowly and relentlessly squeezed through a door crack barely wide enough for a fist. And through it all, Ferguson remained unaware. Even as his face disappeared behind the door, his eyes still stared at Saul, seemingly waiting for a response. But he would never get one. After devouring Ferguson, the colors inside the bronze door surged and roiled like crashing waves. Saul felt as if he stood on a beach, hearing a tidal wave capsizing a ship. Even as he stiffly waited for the door to close, those soft, noodle-like fingers reached out once more. A cold sweat instantly oozed from his pores, the droplets growing and sliding down his body, dragging more sweat with them. Pale fingers crawled along the floor, the walls, the ceiling, tapping, slapping, groping. They were searching for any leftovers. Some of the fingers brushed Saul's ankle, then started climbing up his calf. The motion was exactly the same as when they'd devoured Ferguson. Saul could already envision his fate, bound and twisted like slime, forcefully squeezed through the narrow door crack. He wanted to run, but his diary had warned him. If he moved now, he truly would become dough, kneaded at will. So he didn't even blink, not even a tremor in his pupils. He stood completely rigid, imagining himself as just another corpse nearby. Finally, the noodle-like fingers slowly withdrew, reluctantly retreating back behind the bronze door. Only then did the swirling colors inside begin to subside. The doors began to close. Saul's eyes stayed fixed on the narrowing gap until the bronze doors shut completely. Once the doors sealed tight, he collapsed to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. Huff, huff, huff. He gasped violently, brushing back his sweat-soaked hair before pushing himself up from the floor. He turned around and saw the crowd of corpses crowded in the corridor. All of them were facing the direction where Ferguson had vanished, their long, emotionless faces now twisted into eerie grins. "So tasty, so tasty." Saul backed away a few steps, stopping only when his heels knocked against the door behind him. Still tense with fear, he quickly turned to check and confirmed the bronze door was shut tight, no sign of it opening again. He let out a deep breath of relief. Ferguson had been pulled into the door. His chances of survival were grim. This had to be reported to Mentor Kaz. But first, there was something else Saul needed to deal with. "You guys," Saul looked at the group of corpses still facing the bronze door. "When are you going back?" Back in the second warehouse, the corpses had also been lured by the red candle, but once the candle extinguished, they would automatically return to their places. But now the candle had entered that multicolored world behind the bronze door, which had since closed. So why were these corpses still outside? Saul waited a while, locked in a starring contest with the spooky, still figures. They still didn't move. Each corpse had a serial number. They were valuable warehouse assets. He couldn't just let them loiter outside. Seeing that they weren't moving, Saul sighed heavily. He cautiously pushed the bronze door again. This time, only the right panel opened, revealing a normal room, no swirling colors. Saul looked back at the corpses and asked with a hint of pleading, "The door's open. Can you go back now?" What? What? That day, on May 4th, year 316, the disappearance of third-rank apprentice Ferguson hadn't yet stirred any rumors among the apprentices. That day, a newly promoted second-rank apprentice named Saul spent several grueling hours dragging nearly 100 stiff, heavy corpses from the East Tower's corridor back into the second warehouse. He thought about using Mage Hand, but like with Ferguson, the magic composing it was instantly drained the moment it touched the corpses. Only physical contact could move them. After setting down the final corpse, Saul grabbed the warehouse manual and coldly checked every serial number one by one. Once he confirmed none were missing, he slammed the manual onto the desk. Then he shoved the big crate beneath the discarded candle stand right in front of the corpse crowd, plopped down onto it, and caught his breath, sweeping his gaze across their standing figures. "I've figured it out," Saul muttered, arms trembling with exhaustion. "Aside from the corpses of the true wizards, the rest of you all ran outside to watch the show, didn't you? These corpses might have had a fearsome reputation, but after hundreds of close encounters, Saul didn't feel much awe anymore. If it's red candles you want, I've still got a few. Was it really necessary to go through all that trouble just to run outside?" He wanted to knock on their heads one by one, but recalling their behavior after Ferguson vanished, he chickened out. All he could do was grumble, "Fine, so you went out. But why can't you come back on your own? Were you trying to tire me out?" Chapter 177, A Gift of Knowledge. There was no point complaining to the corpses. Saul hadn't broken any rules. These corpses couldn't hurt him. But if he did violate the rules, they wouldn't let him off either. After spending half the night tending to the corpses, Saul made a point to report to Kaz the next morning. He glossed over the private transaction, merely mentioning that after he accidentally pushed open 2 doors, the senior apprentice beside him had been dragged in by something with noodle-like arms, and still hadn't come out. Sure enough, Mentor Kaz didn't ask for any details. He simply said, "Understood." 2 days later, Saul brought the 2 books he'd borrowed on wraiths to the library on the 10th floor of the East Tower. Of the 2 books he'd found, only one mentioned anything related to the nightmare butterfly, and even then the information was vague. All Saul gathered was that the nightmare butterfly was terrifying, could muddle a person's perception and could be captured. Beyond that, he learned almost nothing. Even the identity of the third narrator in that story was suspect. Who was he, really? An outsider who had witnessed the tragedy, or the nightmare butterfly itself? With no other clues, Saul could only temporarily reinforce the seal on the nightmare butterfly's cocoon and refrain from further research. He was afraid it might one day crawl back into his eye. He decided to deal with his physical issues first, then invite the diary to help study the cocoon later. Returning to the present, Saul stepped into the library. Today, the place was unusually lively. Quite a few apprentices were lingering around the first few rows of bookshelves. The haughty young librarian was still on duty. Saul walked straight over. "Hello, Mr. Librarian. I'm here to return these 2 books." The young man turned his head with a sneer, but when he saw it was Saul, his expression changed to one of tension. "Oh, just hand me the books." Saul was surprised. In the past, returning books always involved logging them at the librarian's desk and then putting them back himself. If you didn't return them to the right place, the librarian would jack up the prices on your next loan, brutally. The kind of price hike that could scar any apprentice for life. But today, why was the process different? Saul didn't understand what had gotten into the librarian, but with so many apprentices around, he obediently handed over the books. When it came to this kind of thing, Saul was always quite cooperative. "Are you borrowing more books today?" The young man suddenly asked as Saul was about to leave, having briefly hesitated after taking the books. Saul hadn't planned to borrow more, but since the other party was surprisingly polite for once, he cautiously replied, "I don't have much magic crystal left." He had just earned 500. After all, the candle had ended up in Ferguson's hands. So despite all the chaos, the deal was technically a success. But money was never enough, especially as your power grew, prices scaled accordingly. It was said that true wizards used experimental materials that were astronomically expensive, which was why they usually made their own instead of buying them. Ahem, we've got some soul-related books that are damaged or defiled. I remember you're interested in that kind of thing. Want to take a look? The library sells books. Saul was immediately intrigued. In the wizarding world, the unknown usually meant danger, so libraries weren't necessarily safe. If all books were open access, 9 out of 10 tower apprentices would probably lose their minds. But if he could buy books at a discount, Saul was more than willing to risk it. After all, he could tell whether a book was dangerous before opening it. Yes, because they're damaged or stained, once we confirm they're safe, we sell them at a discount to suitable apprentices. Saul still found it odd, but I've been in the Wizard Tower for 2 years and never heard of this. You think organizing a library is easy. Once every 2 years is already pushing it, the youth snapped, looking ready to lose his temper. Seeing the familiar crankiness return, Saul actually felt a little relieved. "Then please show me the way." The youth lifted his chin. "Go to the first column, 8th row of shelves. That's where the books marked for disposal are." Saul glanced around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He even sneaked a peek at the diary on his shoulder. No reaction. Only then did he head toward the first column of shelves. This should be the 8th row. He reached the designated spot and saw no one nearby. So only suitable candidates are told about this. Not many people know, huh? Saul muttered to himself as he approached the shelf. There were only a few books on it, tossed around in a disorganized mess. Most were lower-level books, without any protective seals. Saul could see all the covers at a glance. One of them was even a book he'd borrowed back when he was still a first-rank apprentice. He turned to inspect a few others. Sure enough, 2 were related to souls. Just as he leaned in to examine them more closely, a figure suddenly appeared beside the shelf, right in front of him. It was the elderly librarian. Hands clasped behind his back, he strolled past the 2 soul-related books Saul had just eyed. The Book of Ethereality and How to Hide in the Cracks. One is missing its entire second half, and the other's middle portion is irreparably stained. Though they're incomplete, they still offer fragmented knowledge. The old man slowly turned around, still with his hands behind his back, and surprisingly wore a smile. 1 book for 300 magic crystals or 29 credits. If you want both, 560 crystals or 54 credits total. Wait, was that a bundle discount? Saul stepped forward. Can I look through them first? He'd always been allowed to skim the first few pages, before borrowing a book. But the old man shook his head. No disposal books, no previews, buy it or leave it. That felt a bit unreasonable. Whether in credits or magic crystals, this wasn't a small amount for Saul. He hesitated, but the titles alone were tempting, especially the second one. It always reminded Saul of those black shadows that would dart into the cracks in the stone floor before the Tower Master showed up. I'll take both, paying with credits. Saul gritted his teeth and made the purchase. He was low on crystals, but he still had some credits. Senior Wright had immediately repaid his loan contract after returning to the tower, and Saul had managed to save over 100 credits a few days ago. But with all the experiments and borrowed books lately, that balance had already dropped below 100. This purchase would bring him down to just 30 credits. Still, for a wizard, knowledge was everything. Even if it hurt, Saul firmly decided to buy both books. Others might worry that incomplete books could mislead them onto dangerous research paths. But Saul had the diary of a dead wizard. It could always correct his mistakes. At worst, he wouldn't find the right path, but he wouldn't spiral into madness and die from misinterpretation. Hearing Saul's decision, the old man's smile deepened. Very well, take the books and go pay. With that, the old man's figure vanished abruptly, leaving only his echo lingering in Saul's ear. Was he really here just to pitch a sale? Do they get commissions for selling books? Still confused, Saul stepped forward and picked up the two books. Suddenly, a hand wrapped in pink bandages snatched the Book of Ethereality from his grasp. Saul looked up and found himself face to face with the Tower Master, completely cloaked in a reddish-brown robe. Tower Master. Gorsa held the book up, eyed it for a few seconds, and gave an ambiguous grunt before casually tossing it back onto the shelf. That slim book, barely a centimeter thick, hit the shelf with a loud thud. The whole structure even shook a little. As if it wasn't a book that landed, but a person. Chapter 178, The First Step Toward Recognition. That book is a problem, Saul asked in surprise. No, Gorsa replied, his voice still gentle. It's just that you have no use for it. Saul tightened his grip on the one remaining book in his hands. By all rights, he should have handed over the second book to the Tower Master at this point, but for some reason, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. That earlier crash had felt like a strike to his heart. With the Tower Master's arrival, even the faint murmurs from outside the library had faded into silence. There's no need to be afraid. The Tower Master gave Saul a playful wink. His hand emerged once more from under the cloak, and in his palm stood a red candle, half burned. Did you make this yourself? Saul was stunned. Wasn't that the red candle swallowed by the bronze door? Could it be that what lay behind that bronze door was actually the place where the Tower Master resided? Yes, I used a bit of wax from the storeroom, about the size of a fingernail. The rest of the materials were mine. Since he had been found out, Saul saw no point in lying. He might as well come clean and hope for leniency. Gorsa didn't seem angry, or at least he didn't show it. Kaz used to assign the most gifted apprentices to guard the storeroom, but we noticed that the more talented they were, the faster the materials vanished. Overconfident, many ended up dying in experiments they couldn't control, so I suggested to Kaz that we switch to a more mediocre apprentice. Sure enough, in the first few years after the change, material consumption slowed, and the apprentice guarding the storeroom managed to survive. But now you've taken over, and it's only been a few days before you dared lay hands on my candles, till the storeroom supplies are doomed again. Saul wasn't sure if the Tower Master was praising or scolding him. I'm sorry, Tower Master. Gorsa narrowed his eyes and withdrew his hand, without returning the candle. No need to apologize. Letting you all guard the storeroom is tacit permission to use the materials. The reason I wanted a mediocre apprentice was because the previous geniuses, while passionate about experiments, either lacked creativity or pursued directions I didn't care for. That was a waste. But you're different. I really liked the first magical item you crafted. It seems I underestimated your talent and ability. Only by giving you a bigger platform can I expect greater rewards. Now I'm offering you a choice. Gorsa walked slowly into the depths of the library. His figure became obscured by the mist, but his voice remained crisp and clear. If you're willing to accept this gift of knowledge, then come with me. If you fear the risks of the unknown, then leave the library. Saul was already burdened with a mountain of troubles. The nightmare butterfly whose seal might not last, the secret of his body melting and mutating, his still skeletal arm, the electric problem unresolved, and the conspiracy around resurrection that Vinny had mentioned. Saul let out a long sigh then, followed with an excited grin. One more debt won't make a difference. This is a gift of knowledge. Just the name alone gets my mental body boiling. If I miss this chance, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Clutching the book to his chest, Saul stepped forward with tingling excitement and a wildly beating heart, walking firmly into the white mist where the Tower Master had vanished. Once Saul was completely engulfed in the mist, he lost all sense of direction. Even the path he had come from was gone from memory. There were no bookshelves around, no walls in sight, not even a defined light source, just a hazy glow. Just as Saul stood there paralyzed by uncertainty, a voice called out, "Follow me." Gorsa's silver eyes appeared in the distance, shining through the white fog, like twin searchlights piercing endless night. Saul immediately followed. He had the vague sense that he was climbing. Looking down, even his feet were swallowed by the mist. Only the book in his arms remained clearly visible. After about 5 minutes of brisk walking, the white mist suddenly cleared, and his view opened up. What appeared before Saul was a long, curved corridor, lined on both sides with tall wooden bookshelves reaching the ceiling. The shelves looked quite ordinary, decorated with patterns of flowers and leaves. Each shelf held quite a few books, though not crammed full, deliberately arranged, giving off a peaceful, leisurely vibe. The books were placed openly, without any attempt at concealment, and didn't seem particularly dangerous. Gorsa stood at the far end of the corridor, and Saul hurried to catch up. "These are just miscellaneous books I collected during my travels. Most aren't very useful, but every now and then I'll flip through one. They're quite amusing." Gorsa stood before a white door, adorned with a golden magical sigil, ornate as a noble's gilded accessory. This room contains nearly all the records related to soul research. Once you enter, you'll have to carefully judge what knowledge you can read and what you can't. I'll give you a key. Only you can enter. Anyone else will be swallowed by the door. Gorsa turned back and looked down at Saul, just like that apprentice who got swallowed yesterday. "Yes, sir." Since the Tower Master had the red candle, he clearly knew Ferguson had also been in the bronze chamber. But he brought out the candle and not Ferguson, which must mean Ferguson was already dead. "Left hand or right hand?" The question came out of nowhere, but Saul answered immediately, "I'm right-handed." "Good, then give me your left hand." Saul raised his left hand, still a skeletal one. "Still no progress on modifying the soul resin?" Gorsa asked casually. Then, suddenly, he reached out and snapped off the tip of Saul's pinky finger. "So?" Gorsa took the fingertip and inserted it directly into the white door's keyhole. After about 5 seconds, he pulled it back out and pressed the now-transformed bone back onto Saul's hand. Saul stared dumbfounded at his hand. The tip of his left pinky had become elongated, like a beast's claw. He reached with his right hand and tugged on it twice. It was firmly attached, not falling off at all. "Remember to use the key before opening the door. Oh, and start preparing. You'll be heading out at the end of May. It was early May now, so over 20 days remained. Yes, Tower Master, where will I be going? I don't know, the driver will take you. You'll be handling a mess left over from 2 years ago. It might be dangerous. Bring plenty of things to help you stay alive. Saul thought for a moment. Tower Master, may I bring some companions with me? Gorsa looked at Saul, then gave a faint smile. Some things are better not shared. This task isn't simple. If you're afraid, you can refuse. I accept, Saul answered without hesitation, calm and steady. Though Gorsa hadn't said so outright, Saul understood. This too was a test. If he refused, he might also be refusing all future opportunities. Sure enough, after Saul gave his reply, Gorsa's silver eyes curved into a smile. Having finished giving instructions, Gorsa told Saul to act on his own, then entered a brown door beside the white one. That door must lead to the Tower Master's living quarters. Saul caught a glimpse, a cozy sofa and a small table with food. But clearly, Gorsa had no intention of inviting Saul in. The view of the living quarters vanished in an instant as the door shut behind him. No compromises. Saul was left standing alone in the corridor. He looked around. There were several other white doors lining the hallway, presumably rooms containing equally dangerous materials. At the end of the library corridor, a familiar ramp came into view. This must be the floor reserved exclusively for the Tower Master, just not sure which exact level. Levels 18 through 21 of the Wizard Tower belonged solely to the Tower Master. No one else was permitted to live or conduct research there. Unfortunately, none of the floors in the tower were labeled, which made things rather inconvenient. Saul being allowed in here to read books already meant he had earned Gorsa's initial approval. But if he truly wanted Gorsa's full recognition, he would have to pass a series of trials. The dangerous mission at the end of May was one such trial, and certainly not the last. If I make it through all of this, what will be waiting for me in the end? Yura, the horde of corpses, Mentor Kaz, Mentor Rum, Concha, their faces flashed through Saul's mind like a revolving lantern. Expressionless, he walked up to a large white door engraved with a golden magic array. He inserted the pinky finger of his left hand into the keyhole. Unlike a regular lock, Saul felt something envelop his finger bone briefly, before quickly releasing it. Then the white door popped open with a faint click. Saul pushed it open, revealing a study dominated by white tones. Opposite him was a massive floor-to-ceiling window. The sunlight streamed in just right. He reached back and closed the door. No matter what, I won't become one of those ghosts doomed to wander beneath the Wizard Tower for eternity. Whether Master Gorsa is raising me to be an experiment or genuinely grooming me to be his assistant, I'm not going to waste this opportunity. Schemes, let them scheme. Manipulation, fine by me. No one in this world is born obligated to be kind to another. In the world of wizards, even stagnation is a mistake. If I give up now, I might as well have died back when I was just a servant. Right, dear diary. Saul twisted his neck from side to side, glancing at the diary quietly floating over his left shoulder. Which of these books can I read right now, I wonder? What? Saul vanished into the depths of the library, and that same evening, he descended from the floor reserved for the Tower Master. This didn't become widely known, but a few watchful eyes who had been keeping track of him took note. East Tower, Level 16, Mentor Ann's quarters. While Rum was confined to one corner of his spacious quarters due to health issues, Ann's rarely left his room simply because he disliked hassle. He had the most apprentices among the 5 mentors. Almost all of his research and experiments were carried out by students, while he merely oversaw progress and steered direction. Today, upon hearing that Saul had descended from level 18, he immediately summoned Lokai, the president of the Mutual Aid Association. Have you been keeping an eye on Saul's movements lately? Lockeye wore his usual playful grin when speaking with his mentor. Haha, of course. You told me to monitor him closely, so I've been pouring all my energy into it. Any findings? Oh, Saul. He managed to kill a third-rank apprentice like it was nothing. Officially, it's still being treated as a disappearance, but it won't be long before it's confirmed as death. We just haven't figured out how exactly he pulled it off. Ans closed his eyes in thought. Was that third-rank apprentice someone you sent? Yes, haha. Lockeye, 27 years old, had been stuck as a second-rank apprentice for over a decade. He was once a dazzlingly talented apprentice, but after so many years in the same stage, everyone had forgotten that. His light had long been overshadowed by rising stars like Bill, Billy, and Wright. He seemed to have accepted his fate, now running the Mutual Aid Association and acting as Ann's errand boy. And he genuinely seemed to enjoy it. But very few knew that Lockeye was one of Ann's key pieces. He was like a fisherman at sea, holding all the nets in his hands. Ferguson's lightning flared up the day Saul took over Warehouse 2. Heh. With his hot-headed and arrogant nature, he definitely would have made a move on Saul. And while Saul has talent, he's no match for Ferguson, especially when lightning directly counters his abilities. Lockeye gleefully recounted every step of his plan to Ans. Next, we just need to find Ferguson's corpse. Then we can determine whether the great Tower Master personally intervened to save Saul. Ans folded his hands together. Gorsa has never involved himself in conflicts between apprentices. The last time he appeared outside the tower to save Saul and Wright, he could still claim he was driving off intruders. But if he saved Saul from Ferguson, that means Saul is extremely important to him. Lockeye's eyes sparkled. Exactly. Ans leaned back, sinking into the soft cushions of his sofa. Next, I plan to have Cugin befriend him. That way, we'll have a read on his movements. Once he leaves the tower, everything will depend on your command. But to Lockeye's surprise, Ans raised a hand. No need. Lockeye was momentarily confused. From now on, react as normally as possible. He didn't immediately ask for clarification. Instead, he lowered his head, maintaining his smile while thinking. Eventually, his grin broadened. I see what you mean. The most normal reaction it is. I'll withdraw everyone watching him. Ans nodded. Lockeye, you've always been clever enough. Lockeye's grin widened further, pride dancing in his eyes and curling at the corners of his brow. Well, I'll leave you to rest then. He gave a deep bow and backed out, never turning his back. Just as he was closing the door, he heard Anne speak again. You've got 3 years until 30, feeling nervous. Of course not, Mentor. I'm not the type to compromise. With that, Lockeye gently shut the door. Ans kept his eyes closed, listening to the footsteps fade into the distance. He murmured softly, neither am I. What? Saul spent 10 full days reading in the White Room on level 18. He even discovered 2 new formulas for synthesizing soul resin. One of them, however, was marked by the diary as off-limits for now, so Saul focused on the other. He found that this type of soul resin, called Soul Eye, shared a similar weakness. It feared sunlight. However, unlike his plastic bone, which melted instantly in light, Soul Eye's powers were merely weakened by strong light, and some of its lethal techniques became unusable. What's more, the formula included several ideas for improving this flaw. These had never been implemented due to the high cost of experimentation. Studying the proposed improvements for Soul Eye gave Saul some new ideas for his own plastic bone. Still, his main focus since entering the Tower Master's private library had been on soul research. After reading several experiment reports, he had to admit he hadn't even scratched the surface of this field. No wonder the tower master insisted that only third-rank apprentices were qualified to assist him. Saul resolved to begin a soul-related research project once he reforged his plastic bone. He would pursue this research alongside his work with the locator device. As for the subject and direction of the project, he'd need the diary's help again. He had been so engrossed in the reading that he completely forgot his appointment with Kangsha. That night he was walking down the corridor, holding his notebook of copied information, reading as he walked, when he collided headlong with someone's slender back. The person didn't budge an inch, while Saul himself staggered back 2 steps. Sorry. It was clearly his fault for not watching where he was going, so Saul immediately apologized. Then the person turned around, gently pulling back a wide hood with elegant fingers to reveal half of a beautiful face. Chapter 180, another name for oxidation. After Kangsha revealed her identity, she didn't speak right away. Her crimson lips were pressed tightly together, the edges paling with a sickly hue from how hard she was clenching them. Saul, I waited 10 days for you. I already know your answer, but I still want to ask again. After a long silence, Kangsha finally spoke. Her voice was full of weary compromise. What will it take for you to help me this once? Saul was stunned. He had just remembered the agreement he made with Kangsha. Let's talk inside first. He pointed to the room beside them, his dorm. Kangsha had clearly been waiting for him here on purpose and followed behind Saul without hesitation. His dorm was still a mess. The large boxes stacked by the wall only needed to be resealed to be ready for moving again. Kangsha glanced over the items in the boxes and murmured, "So you're confident you'll advance to 3rd rank soon, so confident you didn't even bother to unpack." "No, I'm just lazy," Saul replied, quickly clearing off a chair for her while he sat directly on one of the sturdy boxes. Hearing the familiar tone, Kangsha felt a flicker of hope. He didn't sound annoyed by her sudden appearance, at least. "Saul, I really need that whisper of the elves. Just let me open the bottle and listen for a few minutes. No, just a few dozen seconds is enough. If you're worried, I can give you more in return. Magical tools, scrolls." Saul frowned, troubled. "Senior Kangsha." "Just call me Kangsha, who still qualifies as your senior now." Saul blinked, unsure what she meant. But when he saw the subtle resentment flickering in her eyes, he figured now wasn't the time to press for answers. So he played dumb and skipped over that line. "All right, I'll take the risk this time." Kangsha immediately perked up, her posture straightening. The wide cloak couldn't hide her striking figure. "Good, good." She was so excited she began to ramble. "Let's go tonight, all right." Tonight? Saul hesitated but understood. She couldn't wait and she was afraid he might change his mind. "Fine. Tonight, 7:55. Kangsha, wait for me at the Bronze Gate. I'll bring number 117 and open the door. We'll make the exchange in under a minute." Kangsha nodded quickly. After agreeing on the details, Saul said seriously, "Kangsha, this isn't our first trade. I hope it won't be our last either." Kangsha froze. Then she realized Saul was warning her not to play any tricks. If it had been any other 2nd-rank apprentice talking to her like that, she would have taught them what it meant to respect their seniors, what the coldness of the wizard tower truly meant. But this was Saul, and to her surprise, she didn't feel the slightest bit of displeasure. Unknowingly, the dynamic between them had completely shifted. Saul was now the rising star in that man's eyes, and she was nothing more than a discarded pawn. The agreement settled, Saul followed Kangsha to her dorm. There, he received 2 locator device schematics and 3 powerful sorcery tools. Among them was iron and fire, the very weapon Saul had once used to kill Seed. Seeing Saul run his fingers over iron and fire with genuine delight, Kangsha forced a smile, despite her low spirits. "After I saw you use this to counter Seed, I realized even wizards can't rely solely on magic and mental power, so I started collecting a few tools. Saul didn't get greedy. He only took the 2 tools he could carry with him, then left Kongsha and headed to the second storeroom. On his way past the second floor of the East Tower, he noticed there was no eyeball placed outside the second corpse room, which meant that even after all this time, Hayden still hadn't made a decision to follow him. Saul felt a bit disappointed, though not surprised. Compared to gaining strength, Hayden seemed to prefer staying in a safe, stable environment. Choosing to follow Saul meant facing the unknown dangers of the wizarding world again. A shift in mindset couldn't happen overnight. If Hayden ended up refusing him, Saul wouldn't be shocked. He kept walking, passing safely through the dark corridor and 3 metal doors, returning to the second storeroom. While studying on the 18th floor, Saul still returned daily to check on the storeroom and see if any tasks had been assigned by a mentor. He just didn't stay here as long anymore. This time, he'd read some notes on the 18th floor that gave him new inspiration for his wizard body modification experiment, prompting his return. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bumped into Kongsha on the way back. Lighting a candle, counting the corpses, checking the communication pen. After completing his routine, Saul eagerly made his way to the long table. He spread out the materials he'd prepared over the past few days, then opened his notebook. He no longer wrote in the common Noah script. Instead, he'd switched to Necrotongue, the language most compatible with dark elements. The characters of this language were filled with sharp strokes and emphasized both visible and hidden symbols, much harder to learn than Noah script. Saul had only recently grasped the basics, hoping to master it through constant practice. On the slightly yellowed pages, Necrotongue recorded his thoughts on the formulas for Soul Eye and Plastic Bone Soul resin more faithfully than Noah ever could. Saul reflected on their similarities. One shared trait was that both were based on normal human tissues, processed with magic, mental force, and other treatments, endowing them with qualities of living organisms. In other words, these soul resins were purified toward a more humanoid form. After all, living humans were among the best and most stable vessels for souls. But because of this, these resins also had clear flaws. Just like humans, relatively fragile beings in the natural world. So how do I minimize Plastic Bone's weaknesses? Saul picked up his pen, thinking as he absent-mindedly scribbled. Soul Eye does it by shrinking the pupil and reducing the lens's light transmission, but the cost is massive loss of vision. But what about Plastic Bone? Should it resist electricity, oxidation, or heat? Seems like very few wizards research how to change the material's nature. And magical oxidation isn't the same as the old chemistry kind. Maybe I shouldn't even call it oxidation. Maybe it should be called corruptive transformation. Just as Saul wrote that, a sudden knock came at the door. Bang, 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 bang. The knocking was frantic and impatient. Who is it? Saul immediately stood up, switching his pen for iron and fire, the weapon he'd borrowed from Kongsha. There was no response from outside. Saul, weapon in hand, walked past the shelves and the horde of corpses until he reached the main door. Who is it? He called again. Haywood, a low male voice finally answered. After a brief pause, he added, first storeroom. Although his first impression of Haywood hadn't been great, Saul quickly opened the door. 2 specimens were just delivered. They've already been processed by Mentor Kaz. Haywood's odd-colored pupils flicked across Saul's face. He stepped slightly aside, allowing Saul to see what was behind him. Specimens, is that what you call corpses? They're not ordinary corpses. Saul stepped out and saw, behind Haywood, 2 enormous transparent cases standing as tall as a person. Inside each box lay a man. If they had been beautiful women, the scene might have evoked the image of Snow White's crystal coffin. but these were men, and men Saul recognized. Herman, Bill,